Imagine standing on a cliff top in southern England 6,000 years ago and looking out not at the shimmering English Channel, but at a vast wooded plain stretching as far as the eye can see. This wasn't some fantasy landscape. It was the last remnant of a real drowned world, now called Doggerland, a land bridge that once connected Britain to the European continent. For millennia, it was the heartland of Britain's hunters, a rich territory of rivers, marshes, and forests roamed by herds of aurochs and red deer. And then slowly, inexorably, the sea rose, fed by the melting glaciers of the last ice age. The heartland became a peninsula, then an island, and finally, it vanished completely beneath the waves. The people who lived there were not erased in a single cataclysmic flood, but their entire world, their ancestral hunting grounds, their sacred sites, were lost to the rising tide over generations. A slow-motion apocalypse that became a fragmented memory, perhaps a myth of a land before the water. This profound loss, this severing of a physical connection to the rest of the world, is the shocking silent prologue to the story we are about to explore. The story of how the island of Britain was utterly and irrevocably transformed. I'm glad you're here, wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It's a quiet corner of the internet, and your presence makes it all the better. Before we dive in, I'd love to see where in the world and what time it is for you. So feel free to leave a comment with your city or country. It's always wonderful to see how far these stories travel. So let us gently step back in time, not just past the Romans or the Iron Age Celts, but further to a Britain that would be entirely alien to our modern eyes. Before 4000 BC, this island was wrapped in a single, immense, and almost unbroken cloak of forest, what ecologists romantically call the wildwood. Picture a canopy so dense that in the height of summer, the forest floor would be a place of deep, dappled twilight, a mosaic of ancient oak, towering elm, lime, and a thick understory of hazel and holly. This was not a managed woodland, but a primeval ecosystem, a world of deep leaf litter, fallen giants slowly returning to the earth, and the constant subtle sounds of a wilderness teeming with life. Through this deep forest moved the last hunters of Britain, the people of the Mesolithic or Middle Stone Age. We often imagine them as brutish and simple, but that's a profound injustice. They were masters of this world, exquisitely adapted to its rhythms. They moved in small family-based groups, their lives dictated by the seasons. In the autumn, they might gather by the hazel groves to harvest a bounty of nuts, a vital source of protein and fat for the winter. In the spring and summer, they would follow the herds of red deer, roe deer, and the truly formidable aurochs, wild cattle, massive and notoriously aggressive, the ancestors of our domesticated cows. Their world was rich with resources if you knew where to look. Rivers choked with salmon, coastlines, and estuaries offering shellfish, seals, and seabirds. Their technology was a marvel of microengineering. They didn't wield clumsy clubs, but sophisticated composite tools. Their specialty was the microlith, a tiny, razor-sharp flint blade, sometimes no bigger than a fingernail. These were not tools in themselves, but components, like disposable blades for a utility knife. They would be set in rows along a bone or wooden shaft to create the deadly cutting edge of a harpoon, the barbs of an arrow, or the blade of a knife. This was a lightweight, versatile, and highly sustainable toolkit, perfect for a people on the move who needed to travel light and make the most of every resource. Their homes were not permanent villages but seasonal camps, perhaps simple hide tents or lean-tos built against a rock face, occupied for a few weeks or months before the group moved on, following the animals or the ripening plants. They left behind a ghost-like archaeological footprint, scatters of these tiny flint microliths, charcoal from their hearths, and gnawed animal bones. They understood this land with an intimacy we can barely conceive of. Every stream, every game trail, every stand of useful plants was mapped in their minds. They had no concept of land ownership. The land, in a very real sense, owned them. It was their provider, their home, the resting place of their ancestors, an entirely encompassing spiritual and physical reality. For at least 6,000 years after the ice retreated, this was the unchanging rhythm of life in Britain. But across the water, the world was changing. In the Near East, a revolution had begun thousands of years earlier, a radical new idea that was now slowly, inexorably making its way across Europe. It traveled at a sluggish pace, maybe a kilometer a year, not as a conquering army, but as a wave of cultural diffusion, a slow creep of ideas, seeds, and people. This was the Neolithic revolution, the invention of farming. It was a package of innovations that would completely rewrite the human story. It involved clearing the land, planting seeds like emmer wheat and barley, and domesticating animals, corralling and breeding cattle, sheep, pigs, and goats, transforming them from wild prey into a walking larder. With farming came other technologies, the ability to create pottery for storing grain and liquids, and the need to build permanent, substantial houses to stay with the crops and herds. This new way of life promised a more stable food supply, a release from the constant wandering of the hunt. It allowed for, and in fact demanded, a completely different relationship with the land. You no longer moved through it. You owned it, you shaped it, you defended it. The great, lingering mystery, the central question that hangs over the beginning of our story, is how this revolution came to the shores of Britain. For a long time, the prevailing theory was one of massive replacement. Boatloads of sophisticated Neolithic farmers arrived from the continent, so the story went, and they simply outcompeted the primitive local hunters, who were either wiped out or pushed into the bleakest margins of the island to slowly fade away. It was a clean, if rather grim, narrative. More recently, scholars have preferred a gentler model, one of cultural exchange and adoption. Perhaps a few migrants brought the ideas, and the local Mesolithic people, seeing the benefits, gradually adopted farming themselves, intermarrying and creating a new hybrid culture. It's a much nicer story. But the latest and most powerful evidence from ancient DNA analysis has swung the pendulum back towards a more dramatic transition. It suggests that around 4000 BC, there was indeed a substantial migration of people into Britain from the European mainland, people whose ancestry traces back to Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, where farming first began. These newcomers seem to have replaced about 90% of the indigenous British gene pool within a few centuries. This raises a host of dark and difficult questions. Was this replacement violent? Did the migrants bring diseases to which the locals had no immunity, like a prehistoric version of what happened in the Americas? Or did the hunters' way of life simply collapse as the forests were cleared and the game disappeared? We don't know for sure. There are no written records, only the silent testimony of bones and stones. What is clear is that on the cusp of 4000 BC, the ancient wildwood world of Britain's first people was about to end, and the sound of a new kind of stone tool, the polished axe, was about to ring out among the trees, heralding the dawn of an entirely new age. The arrival was not a grand invasion, not an armada of Viking longships crashing onto the shore in a cinematic wave of violence and steel. It was something quieter, more piecemeal, and in its own way, far more revolutionary. Imagine small, tough, skin-on-frame boats, little more than articulated baskets of wood and hide called currachs, or perhaps heavy dugout canoes carved from single massive tree trunks. These vessels, loaded to the point of absurdity, would have appeared like strange, floating menageries as they navigated the unpredictable currents of the channel. On board were not warriors in the traditional sense, but families, men, women, and children, their faces set with the grim determination of people who have left one world behind and are gambling everything on another. And with them came their most precious cargo, the living, breathing, and probably very seasick components of their new world order. A few crumbling cattle, a handful of bewildered sheep, a goat or two, and perhaps some squealing pigs, all of them representing a complete break from the natural order of the island they were approaching. These were not wild beasts to be hunted. They were property, a walking larder, a source of milk and power, and their presence in these boats was a declaration of intent. These people weren't coming to visit. They were coming to stay, to transform the very ground beneath their feet. The people themselves were different. The DNA evidence we touched on before is quite clear on this. While the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, who had inhabited Britain for millennia, were part of a lineage known as the Western hunter-gatherers, with genetic markers suggesting they likely had darker skin and blue eyes, these newcomers were genetically distinct. Their ancestry traced back through Europe to the first farmers of Anatolia. They probably had lighter, more olive-toned skin, brown eyes, and dark hair. Crucially, like almost all adults at this time, they were lactose intolerant. The ability for grown humans to digest milk is a much later genetic mutation that would spread precisely because of the new relationship with cattle these people were introducing. So when a local Mesolithic forager, perhaps scouting the coast for seals, first saw one of these strange boats land, they would have seen people who not only looked different, but who behaved in an utterly bizarre fashion, unloading noisy, smelly beasts that they seemed to cherish, and carrying with them sacks of mysterious tiny objects, the seeds of emmer wheat and barley. It was a culture shock of the highest order, a confrontation between two entirely different ways of being human. One was fluid, moving with the landscape's rhythms. The other was static, determined to bend the landscape to its will. Alongside the animals and seeds came the third piece of the Neolithic toolkit, pottery. It's hard for us, in our world of mass-produced everything, to grasp the significance of the first clay pot. For the Mesolithic people, containers were organic and temporary. Skin bags, woven baskets, hollowed-out gourds. They were light and portable, but they couldn't be placed on a fire, and they were poor at long-term, pest-proof storage. Pottery changed everything. It was born of an almost magical transformation, taking soft, useless mud, shaping it with your hands, and through the alchemy of fire, turning it into a hard, durable, waterproof vessel. The earliest pots found in Britain are known as carinated bowls, elegant, beautifully made containers with a sharp-angled shoulder, or carination, between the neck and the body of the pot. They were part of a ceramic tradition that stretched across the Channel into northern France and Belgium, a clear fingerprint of the migrants' origins. With these pots, you could now do things that were previously impossible. You could boil water reliably, making tough grains and roots digestible. You could create stews, soups, and porridges, unlocking new sources of nutrition. Most importantly, you could store the grain from your harvest, protecting it from damp and mice through the long, lean winter months, a buffer against starvation that the hunter-gatherer could only dream of. Pottery is the ultimate technology of settlement. It is heavy, it is fragile, and it ties you to a place. The great unresolved question, the ghost at the feast of this new beginning, is what happened to the estimated 5 to 10,000 Mesolithic people who were already living in Britain. The genetic evidence, as we've seen, points to a replacement, with over 90% of Britain's gene pool being swapped out within a few centuries. But how did this happen? The archaeological record is stubbornly silent on the matter of a great war. While the Neolithic period certainly had violence, skeletons with arrowheads embedded in them, skulls bashed in by axes, there is no evidence of a systematic, one-sided conflict or genocide of the indigenous population. So, if they weren't all killed in battle, what happened? One persuasive and rather chilling hypothesis centers on disease. The farmers, living in close quarters with their domesticated animals, would have been a reservoir for zoonotic diseases, illnesses that jump from animals to humans, like early forms of influenza or smallpox. The farmers would have had generations to build up some level of immunity. But for the isolated Mesolithic population, these new germs would have been utterly devastating, a virgin soil epidemic that could have swept through their small, scattered communities with terrifying speed, leaving very little trace in the archaeological record beyond an absence of people. Another possibility is more of a slow-burn ecological catastrophe. The farmers' primary activity was clearing the forest to create pasture and fields for planting, a process we will explore in detail. This act alone would have systematically destroyed the world of the hunter-gatherers. The herds of deer and aurochs would have been displaced, the hazel groves and wild fruit trees cut down, the salmon streams, perhaps, muddied and disrupted. The Mesolithic way of life, so exquisitely tuned to the wildwood, would have found its resource base shrinking year by year. It may not have been a violent confrontation so much as a slow, inevitable starvation, a withering on the vine as the world that sustained them was literally chopped down. Or perhaps, and this is the most subtle and melancholy idea, it was a crisis of faith. Perhaps the old ways, the old gods of the forest and the hunt, simply seemed to fail in the face of this new, powerful, and apparently successful culture. Maybe some Mesolithic people, especially the young, simply walked away from their traditions, choosing to join the farming communities, to intermarry and assimilate, their genetic signature diluted into oblivion over generations. Whatever the mechanism, be it germs, ecological pressure, or cultural assimilation, the result was the same. Within 1,000 years of those first strange boats landing, the Mesolithic world was gone forever. A lost chapter written in the waters of the rising seas and the ashes of the burning forests. The newcomers had the island to themselves, and now the monumental work of remaking it in their own image could truly begin. And so began the great unwriting of the wildwood, a slow and patient erasure of the old world, one tree at a time, with a sound that would become the percussive heartbeat of this new age, the steady rhythmic thwack of stone against wood. Before this, the dominant sounds of Britain would have been the wind in the leaves, the call of birds, the snap of a twig under a deer's hoof. Now, a new sound was added to the symphony, a sound of industry, of alteration, a relentless chipping away at the ancient green mantle that had covered the land for millennia. The tool for this monumental task was the Neolithic polished stone axe, and it was as much a symbol of this new era as the smartphone is of ours. It was a leap in technology that seems subtle to us, but was, in its time, utterly transformative. Mesolithic axes had been made by knapping, striking a piece of flint to flake off pieces and create a sharp but rather brittle edge. The Neolithic innovation was to take that knapped axe head and then spend hours, perhaps even days, grinding it against a whetstone with sand and water, polishing its surface until it was smooth, sleek, and lethally effective. This polishing didn't just make it look beautiful, it fundamentally changed its structure, removing the microfractures from the knapping process and creating an edge that was far more durable, less likely to shatter on impact, and could be resharpened time and time again. Holding one of these polished axe heads today is a tactile connection to the past. They are cool to the touch, beautifully weighted, and feel almost alive in your hand, a perfect marriage of form and function. The clearing of the forest was not simply a matter of walking up to an ancient oak and hacking away until it fell. That would have been a colossal waste of energy. These early farmers were nothing if not efficient, and they employed a far more strategic method, a technique we now call slash and burn, or perhaps more accurately, slash and smolder. The first step was to girdle the trees. A team would move through a chosen patch of forest, using their sharp flint axes to cut a deep ring through the bark and the living cambium layer just beneath it, all the way around the trunk. This effectively severs the tree's vascular system, cutting off the flow of sap from the roots to the leaves. The tree is condemned to a slow death, but a useful one. Over the next year or two, it would stand as a pale skeleton, its wood slowly drying out, its leaves withering and falling to create a thick, flammable carpet on the forest floor. Once a significant area of woodland had been prepared in this way, the farmers would wait for a dry spell, and then they would bring the fire. It wouldn't have been a roaring, out-of-control forest fire, but a managed, creeping burn that would clear away all the dead undergrowth, the leaf litter, and the smaller branches, leaving the great, fire-hardened trunks of the dead trees standing like silent monuments in a grey, ashen landscape. This fire did two things at once. It cleared the land for planting with incredible efficiency, and it deposited a thick layer of nutrient-rich ash, potash, into the soil, a natural fertilizer that would guarantee a good harvest for the first few seasons. Only then would the axes come out in force to fell the remaining skeletal trunks for building material or to clear them from the fields. We can imagine the scene: a family group, or perhaps a whole small community, working together in the hazy, smoke-filled clearing. The air would be thick with the smell of wood smoke, an aroma that would have clung to their clothes, their hair, and their homes becoming the permanent perfume of the Neolithic. The labor was immense, a constant training battle against the relentless urge of the wildwood to reclaim any ground that was taken from it. Every field had to be weeded, every pasture defended from encroaching saplings. It was an intergenerational project. The clearing that one generation started, the next would expand, and the results were profound. For the first time in 10,000 years, large patches of the sky were opened up. Sunlight, which had only ever reached the forest floor in dappled, shifting patterns, now flooded the clearings, warming the soil and allowing the alien crops of wheat and barley to grow. This was not just deforestation, it was landscape creation on a scale never before imagined. It was an act of profound and defiant optimism, a statement written in fire and sweat that this place, this small patch of earth, was no longer just part of the forest. It was home. The great mystery that still puzzles archaeologists is the curious case of the elm decline. If you take a core sample from the bottom of an ancient bog or lake, you can read the history of the landscape in the layers of preserved pollen. And right around 3800 BC, all across Britain and northwestern Europe, the pollen record shows a sudden, dramatic crash in the amount of elm pollen. For a long time, this was held up as Exhibit A in the case for Neolithic land clearing. Elm trees have particularly nutritious leaves, and it's known that Neolithic farmers used them as a fodder crop for their cattle, a practice called leaf haying. The theory was that the farmers were systematically targeting the elm trees, harvesting their leaves and branches to feed their livestock through the winter. And this intense pressure caused the population to collapse. It was a neat story of human impact. However, some scientists began to question if stone axe-wielding farmers, who were still relatively few in number, could really have had such a devastating continent-wide impact on a single tree species so quickly. An alternative hypothesis emerged. What if the elm decline was caused not by axes, but by a pathogen? What if this was the first prehistoric outbreak of Dutch elm disease, a devastating fungus carried by bark beetles? In this scenario, the farmers are not the direct culprits, but they might have been accessories to the crime. By clearing land, creating stressed, isolated stands of elm, and perhaps even transporting infected wood, they could have created the perfect conditions for a pandemic to sweep through the elm population. Today, most experts believe the answer is likely a combination of both factors: a perfect storm of human pressure and natural disease that together brought about the end of the age of elm. It's a powerful reminder that these first farmers were not just clearing trees. They were becoming a geological force, a new and unpredictable agent of ecological change on an island that would never be the same again. Out of the ash-rich soil of the newly made clearings, something entirely new to the British landscape began to grow. And I don't just mean the pale green shoots of wheat and barley. For the first time, the architecture of permanence began to take root. The wandering, ephemeral shelters of the Mesolithic hunters, made of hide and bent saplings and designed to be abandoned without a second thought, were no longer fit for purpose. Farming is an anchor. It chains you to the land, to the cycle of sowing and reaping, and to the herds that need tending day and night. This new life demanded a new kind of dwelling, the house, and not just a temporary hut, but a substantial, long-term investment of labor and resources, a fixed point in a world that had, for its previous inhabitants, been defined by constant motion. In the ghostly footprints of post holes and the carbonized remains of ancient timbers, archaeologists have found the blueprints of these first British homes, and they were far from the crude, simple hovels we might imagine. They were, in fact, sophisticated works of carpentry, engineering, and communal effort, built to last for generations. The most common form was a large rectangular timber hall, sometimes stretching for an impressive 15 or 20 meters in length. To build one was a community project. First, the great fire-hardened trunks of the trees felled in the clearing, particularly oak for its strength and longevity, would be split into massive planks and posts using nothing more than stone axes and wooden wedges. This was a feat of incredible skill and patience, requiring a deep, intuitive understanding of the wood's grain. Then, a series of deep post holes would be dug to form the footprint of the house, and these colossal upright timbers would be set in place, forming the load-bearing skeleton of the building. The roof would have been a high-pitched structure, likely thatched with reeds from a nearby marsh or with turf, designed to shed the island's persistent rain. The walls were a clever piece of organic technology known as wattle and daub. Between the main timber posts, a dense lattice of thinner, more flexible rods, usually hazel or willow, the kind of wood that would have been abundant in the regenerating scrub around the clearings, was woven together like a giant sturdy basket. This was the wattle. Then came the daub, a thick, sticky plaster made from a mixture of clay, soil, chopped straw or grass for binding, and often animal dung. This pungent concoction would be slathered onto the wattle by hand, pushed into all the gaps, and smoothed down to create a solid, surprisingly well-insulated wall that, once dried, would be as hard as concrete. Stepping inside one of these halls would be like entering a different world. The outside light would be left behind, replaced by a deep, smoky gloom. The only illumination would come from the doorway and perhaps a few small gaps left in the walls, and most importantly, from the central hearth, which would have been kept burning almost continuously. The air would be thick with the smells of wood smoke, damp earth, unwashed bodies, and cooking stew. A thin haze would hang permanently in the rafters as the smoke made its slow, meandering way out through a simple hole in the roof. The floor would be stamped earth, perhaps covered with rushes for a bit of comfort. This single, large, open space was the theater for all of human life: sleeping, eating, tool-making, child-rearing, and storytelling. We can imagine the scene on a cold winter's night. The entire family or community gathered around the glowing embers of the fire, the flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on the daub walls, the wind howling outside the sturdy oak frame, the precious livestock perhaps brought into one end of the hall for safety and warmth. This wasn't just a shelter. It was a fortress against the wilderness they were trying so hard to tame. A warm, living, breathing heart in the center of their new world. But here lies a fascinating puzzle. Many of these timber halls were enormous, far larger than what a single nuclear family of 4 or 5 people would seemingly require. The well-excavated house at Balbrigdy in Scotland, for example, was 26 meters long and 13 meters wide, a veritable mansion for its time. This has led to a great debate about the social structure of these very first farming communities. Were they egalitarian, with everyone living together in one large communal longhouse, sharing the labor and the rewards equally, like one big extended family? Or does the sheer scale of some of these buildings hint at the very beginnings of social hierarchy? Perhaps a structure like the one at Balbredy wasn't a home for everyone, but was instead the hall of a powerful chieftain, a big man whose success in farming or trade or warfare allowed him to command the labor of others to build him a grander home, a place where he could host feasts and display his authority. We simply don't know. The houses themselves are silent on whether they were bustling egalitarian communes or the private residences of a nascent ruling class. This mystery deepens when we consider the bizarre and widespread practice of deliberately burning these houses down. Archaeologists frequently find that these substantial, labor-intensive structures didn't just fall into ruin over time. Their life ended in a single, catastrophic fire. The evidence, like the vitrified clay of the daub walls, shows they were burned at an incredibly high temperature, suggesting the fire was intentional, perhaps even with the roof dismantled to create a better draft. Why would a community invest thousands of hours of labor to build a magnificent hall, only to ritually destroy it a generation or two later? There are no certain answers, only compelling theories. Was it a form of ceremonial cleansing performed after the death of the patriarch or matriarch who founded the household, a way of sending the house and its contents into the afterlife with them? Was it a symbolic act of renewal, burning the old to make way for the new when the building's life force was considered spent? Or could it have been a form of spectacular, competitive display between rival groups, a prehistoric potlatch where burning your own massive house was the ultimate statement of wealth and power? A way of saying, we are so successful, we can afford to destroy this and build an even bigger one. Whatever the reason, this act of ceremonial destruction suggests that these houses were more than just buildings. They were living entities, imbued with social and spiritual significance, whose lives had a distinct beginning, a middle, and a very fiery, very deliberate end, leaving only a dark stain in the earth as a clue for us to ponder thousands of years later. For a few centuries after their arrival, the landscape of Neolithic Britain was a scattering of these small, smoky clearings, each with its timber hall at the heart, a constellation of tiny human-made stars in the vast dark ocean of the wildwood. But as communities grew and became more established, a new and much grander idea began to take shape, a project that required not just the labor of a single extended family, but the coordinated effort of entire clans, entire regions, all coming together to build something that was not a home for any single person, but a space for everyone. Around 3700 BC, people began to leave their hamlets and ascend the high places, the prominent hills and ridges that overlooked their new farmlands. And there, with the most rudimentary of tools, they began to move the very earth itself, to sculpt the landscape on a scale that was previously unimaginable, creating the first truly public monuments in British history, the causewayed enclosures. These were not buildings of wood and daub, destined to be consumed by fire, but vast circles of chalk and soil, built to endure for eternity. To construct one of these enclosures was a monumental undertaking, an act of social cohesion and sheer physical will. The tools were organic and deceptively simple, picks made from the tough antlers of red deer, shovels fashioned from the broad, scooped shoulder blades of cattle, and woven baskets to carry the loosened earth and chalk. Imagine hundreds of people working under an open sky, a human anthill of activity. The rhythmic crunch and scrape of antler on chalk, the grunts of exertion, the low murmur of voices calling back and forth. They weren't digging a continuous defensive trench like a medieval moat. Instead, they dug in segments, creating a series of interrupted ditches, leaving wide earthen bridges or causeways between each section. The spoil from these ditches, bright, blindingly white chalk in the south of England, was then piled up on the inner side to create a high bank, forming a vast, broken ring, sometimes encompassing an area the size of a dozen football pitches. From the air, they would have looked like a dotted line drawn around the summit of a hill, a ghostly white necklace on a green throat of downland. It's a strange design, and one that immediately raises a question that has vexed archaeologists for over a century. What on earth were they for? The traditional and perhaps most obvious interpretation was that they were forts, the first castles, places of defense in a violent and competitive world. The names some of them still carry, like Hambledon Hill Camp or the Trundle, a word for a defensive circle, speaks to this old idea. But as a piece of military architecture, a causewayed enclosure is, to put it gently, an absolute catastrophe. The presence of all those causeways, those dozens of wide, welcoming gaps in the ditch, makes them completely indefensible. It's like building a fortress and then riddling the walls with unlocked doors. Any attacker wouldn't need a siege engine. They could simply stroll through one of the many entrances. So if they weren't forts, what were they? Another theory suggests they were great trading posts, Neolithic market towns, where different dispersed communities could gather at certain times of the year. Here, they could exchange the things they had in abundance for the things they lacked: pottery from one region, high-quality flint from another, and most importantly, those beautiful polished stone axes that were being traded across hundreds of miles. In this model, the enclosures were neutral ground, a place to socialize, trade livestock, arrange marriages, and reaffirm alliances. This idea gains weight when we look at what was left behind in the ditches. They were not just left to silt up over time. They were used as receptacles for carefully placed, deliberate deposits. Archaeologists excavating these ditches find them filled not with random domestic rubbish, but with curated collections of objects that seem heavy with meaning. You find entire pots, carefully placed at the bottom. You find articulated joints of animal bone, the remains of huge feasts where vast quantities of beef and pork were consumed. And you find skulls, both animal and human. The skulls of aurochs and domestic cattle are particularly common, suggesting these powerful animals held a special significance. The presence of human remains, often fragments of skulls or long bones, deepens the sense of ritual. This doesn't look like a marketplace's garbage. It looks like a series of offerings, of sacrifices, of things returned to the earth. This has led to the most widely accepted theory today, that these enclosures were primarily great ceremonial centers, sacred spaces set apart from the mundane world of farming and domestic life. They were the cathedrals of their day, open-air arenas for the rituals that held society together. This is where the great historiographical mystery truly lies, because they were likely all of these things at once. They probably were not just one thing, but were fluid, multi-purpose sites, their function shifting with the seasons and the needs of the people. Perhaps they were the site of a great summer festival, a combination of religious ceremony, a market fair, and a social get-together, a place where the entire tribe could congregate. The feasting evidence is overwhelming at sites like Windmill Hill in Wiltshire, where the sheer quantity of animal bones suggests gatherings on a scale that would have dwarfed the population of any single settlement. But the human remains hint at a darker, more solemn purpose. One compelling hypothesis is that these enclosures were spaces for the dead, or rather, for the transition between death and burial. It's possible that when a person died, their body was brought to the enclosure and exposed on a raised platform, a practice known as excarnation. Here, the body would be left for the crows and the foxes, for the sun and the wind and the rain, to slowly strip the flesh from the bones. This was seen not as a desecration, but as a necessary purification, a process by which the corruptible flesh was removed, leaving only the clean, eternal, and powerful essence of the person, their bones. Once this process was complete, the bones could then be gathered up and taken for their final burial in another kind of monument that was beginning to appear in the landscape, those long barrows we have yet to explore. In this light, the enclosures become liminal spaces, thresholds between the world of the living and the realm of the ancestors, their broken ditches, not failed defenses, but symbolic, porous boundaries between the sacred and the profane. Their true purpose may forever elude us, a silent question written in chalk on the hillsides of a long-vanished world. And so, once the elements had done their patient work at those great open-air enclosures, once the flesh had fallen away and only the clean, hard, enduring truth of the bone remained, those sacred remnants needed a final and fitting resting place. This was not to be a simple grave, a hole in the ground to hide away the dead. It was to be a house, built with as much, if not more, care and communal effort than the great timber halls of the living. These were the houses of the ancestors, the long barrows, and they represent one of the most profound shifts in human consciousness. The decision to build for eternity, to create a permanent physical anchor for the community's relationship with its own past and its own identity. They began to appear in the landscape as great, silent, sleeping beasts, long, humped mounds of earth and chalk, sometimes stretching for 100 meters or more, like immense, beached whales on the green downlands. They were deliberately conspicuous, often built on slight ridges or facing the morning sun, designed to be seen from the valleys where people lived and worked. A constant, looming reminder of the lineage that gave them their right to be there, their claim to the land they had carved from the forest. The construction of a long barrow was an epic of labor. Before any earth was moved, a core structure was built, a kind of internal skeleton that would contain the sacred deposits. In some regions, this was a long, complex timber building, almost like one of the houses for the living, which would be used for a period before being deliberately buried, entombed within the mound itself. In the west and north of Britain, where good stone was plentiful, these internal structures were even more ambitious. They were megalithic chambers, built from colossal slabs of rock, or megaliths, that had been dragged for miles from their source, levered upright, and capped with massive lintels to create a series of small stone-lined rooms deep within the barrow. The entrance to the barrow was almost always at the wider, higher eastern end. And it was here that the architecture became truly theatrical. The facade was often flanked by a crescent of huge, upright timbers or a forecourt of standing stones, creating a formal entrance, a kind of stage set for the rituals that must have taken place there. At sites like West Kennet Long Barrow in Wiltshire, the entrance is blocked by gigantic sarsen stones, a monumental doorway that wasn't just functional, but was a powerful statement of permanence and exclusion. This wasn't a place you could just wander into. Access was controlled, sacred, and likely reserved for a chosen few. To step through that stone doorway, perhaps on a day of ceremony, would be to leave the world of light and life behind. You would move from the bright open air of the forecourt into a narrow, low-slung passage that led deep into the cold, silent heart of the mound. The temperature would drop immediately. The air would become still and heavy with the smell of damp earth, old stone, and something else, the faint, dry, mineral scent of ancient bone. The passage would open into one or a series of small side chambers, and it is here that the ancestors resided. But you would not find neat, articulated skeletons lying in peaceful repose. Instead, you would be confronted with a jumble, a carefully curated chaos of human remains. Skulls might be nestled together in a corner, a pile of thigh bones stacked like firewood against a wall, a delicate jawbone placed carefully in an alcove. The remains of dozens of individuals, men, women, and children, from newborn infants to the elderly, were all mixed together. Archaeologists have found the bones of up to 50 different people inside a single barrow. This was not the burial of an individual, a king, or a hero. It was the tomb of a lineage, a collective. Individual identity, so important to us today, seems to have been deliberately erased, subsumed into the greater eternal identity of the clan, the tribe, the ancestors. This deliberate mixing and sorting of the bones is the profound mystery at the heart of the Long Barrows. It tells us that the funeral was not a single event, but a long, drawn-out process. Remember those bodies, perhaps left to decay for months or years at the causewayed enclosures. This is their final destination. But the bones were not simply dumped here. They were managed. It seems almost certain that the tombs were periodically re-entered long after the initial burials. Perhaps on a significant anniversary, the stone blocking the entrance would be moved aside, and a priest or elder would creep into the darkness with a flickering tallow lamp. They might add the bones of a newly deceased member of the community, but they might also do something else. They might rearrange the existing bones, moving a skull from one chamber to another. They might even remove a bone, perhaps the skull of a great-grandfather or the femur of a powerful matriarch, to be used in a ceremony out in the world of the living, a sacred relic to be consulted or displayed before being returned to the tomb. Who were these people? Did everyone in the community merit a place in the barrow, or only those from a high-status family? And why were some bones and some people seemingly more important than others? Were the skulls, so often found grouped together, considered the seat of the soul, the most potent part of the ancestor? These are questions we may never answer, but what is clear is that these mounds were not just static, sealed tombs. They were dynamic, living places, archives of bone that were actively curated. They were a source of power, a tangible link to the past, and a solemn promise to the future. Each stone and each bone a testament to the belief that a community was not just made of the living, but was a sacred, unbroken chain that included the dead and the yet to be born. As if the monumental effort of building great earthwork enclosures on hilltops and constructing colossal barrows to house the ancestral dead was not enough. Another, even stranger and more enigmatic form of monument began to be etched into the British landscape. While enclosures defined a place and barrows marked a spot, these new creations were all about the line. They were about the journey, not the destination. These are the Cursus monuments, and they are arguably the most baffling structures of the entire Neolithic period. They were not buildings or tombs in any conventional sense, but immense parallel lines of earthen banks with ditches running along the outside, forming vast enclosed avenues that stretched for almost unbelievable distances across the countryside. They look for all the world like ancient runways, or perhaps scars left behind when a giant dragged a colossal rake across the land. They are so large that their full extent is often only visible from the air, and for centuries, antiquarians who stumbled across a fragment of one had no idea they were standing on just a tiny piece of something that continued for miles. The scale of these monuments is staggering and dwarfs that of the causewayed enclosures and even the largest long barrows. The most famous example, the Dorset Cursus, is an act of landscape engineering that borders on the megalomaniacal. It runs for nearly 10 kilometers or 6 miles in a roughly straight line, marching heedlessly over hills and across valleys, its parallel banks maintained at a fairly consistent 90 meters apart. To build it, thousands of people, using only their antler picks and shoulder blade shovels, would have had to dig out a volume of chalk and earth, equivalent to several dozen Olympic-sized swimming pools, and pile it all up into long, neat banks. It is a project that would have taken, by some estimates, well over 500,000 hours of human labor. And for what? It wasn't a road. It has no properly engineered surface, and it often traverses terrain that would be incredibly difficult to walk. It wasn't a defensive structure. Like the causewayed enclosures, its linear form is a tactical nightmare. It wasn't an irrigation channel. Its purpose was entirely symbolic, a testament to a belief system so powerful it could command this level of devotion, this fanatical expenditure of energy. Imagine what it must have been like to participate in whatever ritual these avenues were built for. In their heyday, the banks would have been piled high with freshly dug, gleaming white chalk, 2 brilliant lines of white cutting across the green landscape, visible for miles around. To enter the Cursus at one of its terminal ends would be to enter a curated, controlled world. The high banks on either side would immediately restrict your view, blocking out the surrounding landscape and focusing your entire attention on the long, grassy corridor stretching out before you. You were no longer in the ordinary world. You were on a sacred path. The sky would seem vast and open above, but your horizontal world would be nothing but the green avenue ahead and the white banks beside you. It's an architecture of procession. It's almost impossible to see them and not imagine long, slow-moving lines of people walking their entire length, perhaps chanting, perhaps carrying offerings, perhaps leading a sacrificial animal. The journey itself was the ritual. But what was the purpose of this ritual journey? This is the great unanswered question of the Cursus monuments. The most compelling theory is that they were ceremonial ways, linking different parts of the sacred landscape together. The Dorset cursus, for instance, seems to begin and end at clusters of long barrows, suggesting it may have been a path for funeral processions, a final grand journey for the bones of the dead as they were transported from a place of excarnation to their final resting place in the tomb. Walking the cursus would have been a rite of passage, a symbolic journey through a liminal space that mirrored the soul's journey into the afterlife. The restricted view would have heightened the sensory experience, forcing participants to focus inward on the solemnity of the occasion or forward towards the ancestral mound waiting at the end of the path. Other cursus monuments, like the one that lies just north of Stonehenge, seem to have astronomical alignments built into them. Its long axis points roughly towards the sunrise on the summer solstice. Perhaps the procession was a seasonal one, marking a critical point in the agricultural year. A great public ceremony to ensure the fertility of the crops or the health of the herds. Yet other theories abound, each more intriguing than the last. Could they be symbolic boundaries, great uncrossable lines drawn upon the earth to separate the lands of different tribes, or perhaps to demarcate the world of the living from the spiritual realm of the dead? Or were they a physical manifestation of a myth, a story from the tribe's creation legend laid out on the land for all to see, its course tracing the path of a mythical hero or a river from the dream time? Some have even suggested they were arenas for ritualized competition between different groups, with the parallel banks forming a vast course for a race or a contest, a way of channeling social rivalry into a non-lethal ceremonial form. The truth is, we are deaf to the conversation they were having. They are a statement of immense power and belief, but they are written in a symbolic language that has been entirely lost to time. All we can do is stand in the faint, grassy depressions that are all that remain of these once gleaming white ways, and wonder at the monumental, shared obsession that drove a whole society to carve these enigmatic lines, these silent, mysterious avenues, into the skin of the earth, leaving behind a question mark that stretches for miles. From the monumental, almost incomprehensible scale of the cursus avenues that scarred the landscape, let us now zoom in, contracting our focus from the horizon-spanning line to the intimate circle. From a project of thousands to a craft of one, from the macro to the micro. Let us kneel down by the flickering hearth inside one of those smoky timber halls and consider an object so common, so fundamental to this new way of life that its revolutionary power is easy to overlook: the simple clay pot. Before the farmers arrived, a container was a thing of the forest. A woven reed basket, a stitched animal hide, a hollowed-out piece of wood. These were brilliant pieces of organic technology, lightweight and perfectly suited to a life on the move. But they had a fatal flaw. You could not put them on a fire. The Neolithic pot changed everything. It was born of a kind of primordial alchemy that must have seemed like pure magic. You take a handful of wet, formless mud, something of no inherent value, and through the patient application of skill and the transformative fury of fire, you create a new substance, a man-made stone that is hard, durable, and can hold water. With it, the entire world of cuisine was unlocked. You could now boil, stew, and simmer. Tough grains of wheat could be softened into porridge. Sinewy cuts of meat could be rendered tender in a broth, and disparate ingredients could be melded together into a nourishing meal. But even more importantly, the pot was the ultimate technology of the future tense. It allowed you to store the surplus from the autumn harvest, to keep the precious grains dry and safe from the mice and the mold through the long, dark, hungry months of winter. It was the ceramic manifestation of the farming mindset, a belief in tomorrow, a tangible vessel for planning and providence. The creation of one of these pots was a delicate and uncertain art, a conversation between the potter and the elements. The first step was to find the right clay, a task that required an intimate geological knowledge of the local area. The potter would then have to prepare it, pounding and kneading it to remove any air bubbles that could cause the pot to explode during firing. They would add a temper, a coarse material like crushed up pieces of old pottery, grog, sand, or even fragments of shell or granite. This temper acted as an internal skeleton for the clay, strengthening it and preventing it from cracking as it dried and was fired. With no potter's wheel, the vessel was built up slowly, ring by ring, using a technique called coiling. The potter would roll the clay into long sausages and lay them one on top of another, pinching and smoothing the coils together until the walls grew upwards, a slow and rhythmic process requiring immense patience. The surface would be scraped and burnished with a smooth pebble or a piece of bone, compressing the outer layer of clay to make it less porous and giving it a soft, almost leathery sheen. The finished pot, still a fragile thing of green, damp clay, would be left to dry for days, perhaps weeks. The final ordeal was the firing. This was not done in a sophisticated kiln, but in a bonfire. The pots would be carefully stacked, covered with wood, and a great fire built around them. This was the moment of truth, the point of no return. The potter could only watch and pray that the heat was even, that the pots didn't crack from thermal shock, and that the hours of work would not be reduced to a pile of useless shards. The very first style of pottery that became widespread across Britain is known to archaeologists as Grimston Lyle's Hillware, named after two of the sites where it was first identified. It is a style of breathtaking elegance and simplicity. These were not crude, lumpy vessels, but sophisticated and beautifully proportioned bowls and jars. Their most distinctive feature is a gentle S-shaped profile, a graceful curve from the rim down to a soft, angled shoulder, the caronation we mentioned earlier, and then inwards again to a narrow, rounded base. They are almost entirely without decoration. There are no incised lines, no patterns, no flourishes, just the pure, clean beauty of the form itself. The round bottom might seem impractical to us, who are used to flat-bottomed mugs and pans that sit neatly on a flat stove. But it was a perfect design for a Neolithic hearth. The pot could be nestled securely into the hot embers of the fire, allowing the heat to distribute evenly around its base. The remarkable thing about this pottery style is its uniformity over a vast area. From the south of England all the way to the northeast of Scotland, for a period of several centuries, people were making pots that were recognizably the same. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a shared cultural template, a collective agreement on what a pot should be. It speaks of a world that was far from isolated, a world of connections, communication, and shared ideas that flowed between distant communities. For a long time, the function of these pots seemed obvious. They were for cooking and storage. But the great mystery was, what exactly were they cooking? The pots themselves cannot speak, but they hold a chemical memory of their past, in the very fabric of the fired clay. Microscopic residues of fats and oils from the foods cooked within them can be absorbed into the porous ceramic, and using a technique called lipid analysis, scientists can now extract and identify these ancient molecules. And when they analyzed the residues from Grimston Lyle's Hill, war potsherds found all across Britain, they found something astonishing and transformative: the unmistakable chemical signature of dairy fats, milk. This discovery solves one of the great biological puzzles of the Neolithic. Remember how the first farmers, like most adult humans at the time, were lactose intolerant? They lacked the enzyme to properly digest the lactose sugar in fresh milk. So why keep cows? The pots provide the answer. They were not for drinking milk, but for processing it. They were the world's first cheese-making kits and yogurt makers. By gently heating the milk in these pots and adding a coagulant, they could separate the fatty curds from the watery, lactose-heavy whey. By fermenting the milk, they could create yogurt, where bacteria would consume the lactose. In short, they were using this ceramic technology to turn an indigestible product into a storable, transportable, and highly nutritious superfood. The simple, elegant pot was the key that unlocked the full potential of their livestock, a brilliant cultural and technological solution to a biological problem, allowing them to harvest a sustainable source of protein from their herds without having to kill the animal. It was a quiet revolution, simmering away in a clay pot, nestled in the embers of a fire, while the delicate art of pottery was transforming the domestic world from the inside out. Another, far more brutal and perilous industry was taking place deep within the earth itself, providing the raw power for the entire Neolithic project. The foundation of this new age was not just the seed and the herd, but the stone. And not just any stone. The lifeblood of their technology was flint, the hard, silicious rock that, when skillfully struck, fractures in a predictable way, creating an edge sharper than surgical steel. It was the material for the knives that butchered the cattle, the scrapers that cleaned the hides, the sickle blades that harvested the wheat, and most importantly, the axe heads that were slowly, painstakingly felling the great wildwood. But these farmers and builders quickly learned a geological truth. Not all flint is created equal. The flint you find on the surface, battered by frost and sun for millennia, is often riddled with hairline fractures and impurities, making it unreliable. The good stuff, the prime material, a deep, lustrous black or grey flint with a fine, consistent grain that knappers called floorstone, lay buried, deep underground, in pristine seams where it had formed millions of years ago. To get it, you couldn't just look for it. You had to go down into the dark, into the earth's belly, and mine it. This was the birth of large-scale industry in Britain, and its epicenters were places like Grimes Graves in Norfolk or Sisbury Ring in Sussex. To visit Grimes Graves today is to walk across a strange and eerie landscape. It's a patch of heathland covered in more than 400 shallow, grassy craters, making it look like a field that has been subjected to a gentle, otherworldly bombardment. Each one of those dimples in the earth is the ghost of a Neolithic mineshaft, dug 5,000 years ago, and now slumped and softened by the passage of time. In their day, this place would have been a hive of activity, a scene of raw, industrial might. Teams of people, organized and driven by a powerful shared purpose, would have undertaken the colossal task of sinking a vertical shaft, sometimes up to 15 meters deep, straight down through layers of topsoil, sand, and solid chalk. Their tools were the same simple organic kit used to build the enclosures. A pick made from the thick brow tine of a red deer antler, a shovel fashioned from the scapula of an ox, and a basket to haul the rubble to the surface, hand over hand, load after painstaking load. Imagine the work. The shaft would be just wide enough for one or two people to work in, a narrow, claustrophobic well. As they dug deeper, the world of sunlight and fresh air would recede, replaced by a cold, subterranean gloom. The air would grow still and stale, thick with the dry mineral smell of chalk and the sweat of human exertion. The only light would come from above, or from a crude tallow lamp, a lump of animal fat with a wick, producing a feeble, smoky, flickering glow that would cast huge, monstrous shadows against the white chalk walls. And all the while, the single greatest terror of any miner in any age would have been a constant companion, the threat of collapse. With no wooden pit props, their only protection was the structural integrity of the chalk itself. Every creak, every trickle of dust from the shaft wall would have sent a spike of fear through their hearts. This was not a job for the faint of heart. It was a descent into a dangerous and alien underworld. When the miners finally reached the prized floorstone seam, their job was far from over. To maximize their haul from a single shaft, they would begin to excavate sideways, following the seam of big, beautiful flint nodules. They would carve out a series of low, radiating tunnels or galleries, sometimes only a meter high. To work in them, they would have had to lie on their backs or bellies, chipping away at the chalk face in the cramped, suffocating darkness. Their world reduced to the few feet illuminated by their sputtering lamp. The flint nodules they prized loose would be passed back to the base of the shaft and hauled to the surface, where a different kind of specialist was waiting, the flint napper. These master craftsmen would sit amidst piles of the raw nodules, and with a few precise, economical blows from a hammerstone, they would rough out the basic shape of an axe head, a blank form that could then be traded and taken away for the long, patient process of polishing. This was a production line, a system of extraction, initial processing, and distribution that was as sophisticated, in its own way, as any modern factory. But the great, haunting mystery of the flint mines is that they were clearly much more than just industrial sites. They were sacred places, and the work done there was steeped in ritual. In the abandoned galleries of Grimes' graves, deep underground, miners left behind strange, votive offerings. They carved enigmatic patterns into the chalk walls. They left behind carefully placed deposits of fine antler picks, too good to be simply discarded. And in one gallery, they created what can only be described as a shrine. A number of the very best antler picks were piled up like offerings at the base of a pillar of chalk, and seated before them was a small, crudely carved chalk figure that has been interpreted as a pregnant woman, an earth mother or goddess of the mine. Was this a plea for protection from the dangers of the deep? Was it an offering made to the spirits of the underworld, a thank you for the gift of the flint, and a prayer to ensure that the seam would remain fertile and continue to provide its bounty? It suggests that the act of mining was seen as a sacred and perilous negotiation with the chthonic powers that dwelt beneath the world of the living. Descending the shaft was not just a job, it was a spiritual journey into another realm. and you did not take from the earth without giving something back. The deep, dark shafts of the flint mines, like those at Grimes Graves, were the engine room of the Neolithic economy, churning out the reliable, mass-produced tools that cleared the forests and built the first farms. Flint was the workhorse, the trusty iron in the soul of the Stone Age. But it was not the only stone, nor was it the most prized. For while the miners of Norfolk toiled in the chalky underworld, other, more adventurous souls were climbing towards the sky, seeking out a different kind of power embedded in the very bones of the mountains. They sought a stone born not in the quiet depths of a Cretaceous sea, but in the violent heart of a volcano, a stone that was tougher, more beautiful, and carried with it the wild, untamable spirit of the high places. This was the luxury goods market of the Neolithic, the quest for a brand, a hallmark of quality and prestige that would become the ultimate status symbol of its time. The polished axe made from the volcanic tuff of the Langdale pikes. Imagine leaving the relative shelter of the lowlands and beginning the arduous ascent into the Cumbrian mountains. The air grows thin and cold. The familiar sounds of the farm, the lowing of cattle, the chatter of the hamlet, fade away, replaced by the rush of the wind and the cry of a circling raven. This is a different world, a vertical landscape of bare rock, treacherous scree slopes, and sweeping views that stretch to the distant sea. And here, on the jagged peaks of what we now call the Langdale Pikes, nearly 3,000 feet up, was the axe factory. This was not a mine dug down into the earth, but a quarry clinging to the side of a mountain. Here, Neolithic prospectors had identified an outcrop of a very special rock, a greenish-gray, fine-grained volcanic tuff, which geologists now label Group 6. It was incredibly hard, even tougher than flint, and when polished, it took on a deep, lustrous, almost jade-like beauty. Working here would have been a brutal seasonal affair, likely undertaken in the summer months, when the weather was least hostile. Using heavy stone mauls, the quarrymen would smash out rough blocks of the tuff, which were then worked on the spot into rough-outs, the basic chunky shape of an axe head. The evidence of their labor is still there, a vast litter of stone flakes and discarded rough-outs that carpets the mountainside, a silent testament to an industry that thrived in this impossibly difficult environment. These roughouts were the precious cargo that was then brought down from the mountain, a perilous journey in itself, and distributed. But the work was only half done. The true magic, the process that transformed a functional tool into an object of desire, was the polishing. This was an act of almost fanatical patience. An individual might spend 40, 50, perhaps even 100 hours on a single axe head. They would sit for days grinding the rough-hewn stone against a wetted block of sandstone, slowly, painstakingly, wearing away all the jagged edges from the initial flaking, smoothing the surface until it was as slick and cool as a river pebble. The final polish, perhaps using a piece of leather and fine sand, would bring out the deep, swirling colors of the stone, creating an object that was not just a tool, but a piece of sculpture. It felt heavy and perfect in the hand, a concentration of human skill and the mountain's ancient power. And here is where the story becomes truly extraordinary. These Langdale axes did not stay in Cumbria. They traveled. They have been found in almost every corner of the island of Britain. A Langdale axe was unearthed from a bog in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland. Another was found in a grave in Kent, on the southeastern tip of England. They have turned up in East Anglia, in Wales, in Yorkshire. They moved across the land over distances of 400 or 500 miles, a phenomenal distribution network for a society without roads, without currency, without a single written word. This was the great axe trade, a silent, intricate web of connections that bound the entire island together. And the great, enduring mystery is how it actually worked. There were no axe merchants with carts, no monetary system to set a price. The most likely explanation is that it was not a trade in the commercial sense we understand, but a system of prestige gift exchange. Imagine a powerful chieftain from a community in, say, the Thames Valley. He makes a journey or sends an envoy to a neighboring group to attend a feast or a ceremony. As a sign of respect and to cement an alliance, he presents the chief there with a gift of several fine flint axes from his local mines. The receiving chief, to show his own power and generosity and to put his guest in his social debt, presents him in return with a single, exquisitely polished greenstone axe from the distant northern mountains. This axe is now a treasured heirloom for the Thames Valley chief. It speaks of his long-distance connections, his ability to command respect from far away. He might keep it for his entire life, a symbol of his authority, before it is eventually placed in his grave, a final, inalienable statement of his importance. The axe's value derived not just from its utility, but from its biography, the story of its journey, the hands it had passed through, the remote and sacred mountain from which it had been born. Some of these axes found in graves show no signs of use at all. Their polished edges are pristine, without a single chip from chopping wood. These were not tools for clearing the forest. They were tools for building society. They were ideas, relationships, and obligations made manifest in stone, beautiful, enigmatic objects that whisper of a lost world, of epic journeys, sacred mountains, and the silent, powerful language of the gift. From the high windswept fells of the Lake District, our story now makes a great leap northwards, far beyond the shores of mainland Britain, across the turbulent waters of the Pentland Firth, to a place that, on any rational map, should have been a remote and marginal outpost of this new Neolithic world. We are going to the Orkney Islands, an archipelago of some 70 islands scattered off the northern tip of Scotland. This is a place that feels like it's on the edge of the world, a low-lying, windswept landscape where the sky seems vast and the sea is a constant, brooding presence. And yet, for a few extraordinary centuries in the late Neolithic, this remote cluster of islands was not the periphery at all. It was the epicenter. It became a vibrant, throbbing heart of innovation, a ceremonial and social capital whose influence would spread south and whose monuments would rival and in some cases surpass anything being built on the mainland, including the early stages of Stonehenge. The question of how and why this windswept, treeless archipelago became the Silicon Valley of the Stone Age is one of the most compelling riddles in British prehistory. The secret to Orkney's unique destiny lies in its geology and its ecology. When the first farmers arrived here, sometime before 3500 BC, they found a landscape utterly different from the dense wildwood that covered most of Britain. Orkney was already largely treeless, a result of its exposure to salt-laden winds. This was both a challenge and an opportunity. The lack of large timber for building meant that the architectural traditions of the South, the great timber halls and wooden-framed barrows, were impossible. But the islands offered a miraculous alternative. Beneath the thin but surprisingly fertile topsoil lay an abundance of a perfect building material, the old red sandstone. This is a sedimentary rock that, through geological happenstance, splits easily and cleanly along its bedding planes, forming flat, straight-edged slabs that are almost like prefabricated planks of stone. For an ambitious builder, it was a gift from the gods. You didn't need to be a master mason to build with it. You just needed a strong back. The Orcadians, out of necessity, became master builders in stone, and in doing so, they created a world that was more solid, more permanent, and which has survived in a state of preservation that is nothing short of miraculous. Their earliest tombs show this local genius already at work. While southerners were building megalithic chambers that were essentially artificial caves of rough, massive boulders, the Orcadians were building what are known as Orkney chromati, stalled cairns. From the outside, they look similar, a long earthen mound. But inside, the architecture is entirely different. They built long rectangular galleries with walls made of beautifully coursed, dry stone walling, and then divided the space into a series of compartments or stalls using upright slabs of that perfect flagstone, like stone bookshelves lining a corridor. The bones of the ancestors were placed upon these stone shelves. It was a neat, orderly, and distinctly Orcadian solution to the problem of housing the dead. For several centuries, Orkney was a prosperous, but relatively conventional, part of the Neolithic world, its people farming the fertile land, fishing the rich seas, and burying their dead in their distinctive local style. Then, around 3200 BC, something changed. A cultural renaissance, a great leap forward, seems to have swept through the islands. It's as if a switch was flipped, and Orkney went from being a quiet rural backwater to a bustling cosmopolitan center of pilgrimage and power. The focus of this new energy was a narrow strip of land on the largest island, mainland, between the two great freshwater lochs of Harre and Stennis. Here, in what is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site called the Heart of Neolithic Orkney, they began to construct a coordinated ceremonial landscape on an unprecedented scale. And at the very heart of this landscape, on a prominent spit of land called the Ness of Brodgar, they built something for which there is no parallel anywhere else in Europe. This was not a tomb, not a henge, and not a village. It was a vast complex of enormous freestanding stone buildings enclosed by a massive stone wall over 4 meters thick. It was a Neolithic Vatican city, a temple precinct that must have drawn people, ideas, and tribute from across the region, and perhaps from much further afield. The buildings within the Ness of Brodgar were architectural marvels. They were huge, oblong structures with walls over 1 meter thick and standing to a height of several meters, built with a precision and flair that is astonishing. The masons used different colored sandstones for decorative effect, and inside the buildings were fitted with sophisticated stone furniture, including dressers, hearths, and tanks. Astonishingly, they even had the world's first stone-tiled roofs. These were not primitive huts, they were cathedrals. And they were clearly not domestic houses. They are far too big, too formal, and they lack the kind of rubbish and debris associated with daily life. So what were they? This is the profound mystery of the Ness. Were they temples dedicated to different gods? Were they the halls of a priestly caste who oversaw the rituals of the entire region? Was this a place of learning, a kind of Neolithic university where esoteric knowledge about astronomy, engineering, and the gods was passed down through generations? The sheer concentration of wealth and labor is staggering. The site has produced vast quantities of highly decorated pottery, beautiful mace heads carved from exotic stones, and evidence of feasting on a monumental scale. This was a place where power, spiritual, social, and political, was concentrated and put on spectacular display. But why here? Why did this remote, windswept place become, for a few centuries, the most important place in Britain? Was it the charisma of a particular leader or spiritual visionary? Or did the unique geology, the easily worked stone, simply allow for a more rapid and spectacular expression of the monument-building urge that was sweeping all of Britain, making Orkney the trendsetter, the place everyone else looked to for inspiration? We may never know the precise reason, but it is clear that for a time, all roads, or rather, all sea lanes, led to Orkney, while the great and the good, the priests and the chieftains, were perhaps overseeing the grand, baffling ceremonies at the Ness of Brodgar. What of the ordinary people? Where were the farmers, the fishers, the craftspeople who supported this explosion of ceremonial grandeur? For a long time, their world was a ghost, overshadowed by the magnificence of the tombs and temples. And then, in the winter of 1850, a ferocious storm battered the west coast of the Orkney mainland. The wind and the waves were so violent, they stripped the grass and sand from a large rounded sand dune known locally as Scarabra or Skarabrae. What the storm revealed was something that had been perfectly sealed, like a time capsule, for 5,000 years. A complete Neolithic village, a prehistoric Pompeii preserved in sand. To step down into the excavated remains of Skarabrae today is to walk into the most intimate and complete domestic world that has survived from this unimaginably distant past. This wasn't a place for the gods or the ancestors. This was a place for living, breathing people, and it gives us our clearest window into the texture of their daily lives. The village is a tight, warren-like cluster of semi-subterranean houses nestled together for warmth and protection from the relentless Orcadian gales. These were not individual freestanding huts, but a single, integrated architectural unit. The houses themselves were sunk into the ground, dug out of a midden, an ancient rubbish heap of household waste, ash and shells, which provided a thick, insulating blanket. The walls, built of that same miraculous flat-bedded sandstone, rose up from this sunken floor, and the whole complex was connected by a series of low, narrow, stone-lined alleyways. These were not open-air streets. They were covered passages, paved and roofed with great stone slabs, creating a system of tunnels that allowed the villagers to move between their homes without ever having to expose themselves to the teeth of a winter storm. It was an incredibly ingenious piece of social design, turning a collection of houses into what was, effectively, one large communal building, a human burrow against the elements. Let's unlatch the stone door of one of these houses and step inside. The first thing that strikes you is that everything is made of stone. With no timber to speak of, the Orcadians became the ultimate masters of stone furniture. And the layout of each house is remarkably, almost unnervingly, uniform. In the center of the single, square room is a large stone-curbed hearth, the heart of the home, which would have been the source of all heat and light, a fire of peat or driftwood perpetually smoldering. The smoke would have simply found its own way out through a hole in the roof, which was likely made of turf or whalebone rafters covered in hides, leaving a permanent smoky tang in the air. Directly opposite the low doorway against the back wall stands the most imposing piece of furniture, the stone dresser. It looks for all the world like a set of shelves, two tiers of flat stone slabs supported by upright piers. This was not for storing plates, but for display. It was the house's mantelpiece, the stage on which the family would place its most treasured possessions. Perhaps a beautifully polished axe head that had come all the way from the Langdales, a string of bone beads, or one of those enigmatic, intricately carved stone balls that are found almost exclusively in this part of Scotland. To the left and right of the central hearth, built into the walls, are the beds. These were not soft mattresses, but rectangular stone boxes, which would have been filled with a deep insulating layer of heather and bracken, and then covered with soft animal furs. The beds are of different sizes. The one on the right as you enter is always larger than the one on the left, a detail that has led to endless speculation. Was this a rigid division of the household? The master and mistress in the big bed, the children or servants in the smaller? Or did it reflect some other, more symbolic, gendered division of the house? Between the beds and the dresser are small, watertight stone tanks set flush into the floor. This is one of Skara Bray's most charming and persistent mysteries. What were they for? The early excavators, with a touch of Victorian whimsy, called them limpet boxes, suggesting they were for keeping fresh seafood. More recent theories suggest they might have been used for brewing a simple ale from barley, or perhaps for a process called croning, where fish was soaked to make it more palatable. The truth is, we don't know, but they are a standard feature of every home. The entire space is a masterpiece of compact, functional design, a standardized blueprint for Neolithic living, repeated with only minor variations from house to house across the entire village. This very uniformity, however, presents its own puzzle. The near-identical layout of the houses has long been seen as evidence of a peaceful, egalitarian society, a community of equals with no one house noticeably grander or richer than any other. It's a lovely utopian vision of the Stone Age. But recent, more careful examination has started to challenge this. One house, known as House 8, stands slightly apart from the main cluster and is built a little differently. It has no beds built into the walls and contains a great deal of debris from flint knapping, leading to the idea that it wasn't a dwelling, but a communal workshop. But was it? Or was it the home of a recluse, an outcast? More tellingly, the famous covered passageways have lockholes and stone bars that can only be operated from inside the houses, suggesting a need for privacy, or perhaps security. And the final chapter of Skara Bray's life is the greatest mystery of all. The popular story is that the village was abandoned in a hurry, its inhabitants fleeing from a single, catastrophic sandstorm that buried their homes in one go. The archaeology, however, suggests a much slower, more melancholy end. The drains became blocked, sand started to build up in the passageways, and the village seems to have slowly choked, becoming more and more difficult to live in, until the last residents simply packed up their most precious belongings, barred the doors on the inside, and walked away, leaving the wind and the sand to slowly, gently bury their world and preserve it for us. As the last families were packing up and leaving the slowly silting sand-choked alleys of Skara Bray, abandoning their stone beds and limpet boxes to the encroaching dunes. Another, altogether more ambitious and enduring kind of stone architecture, was reaching its zenith just a few miles away in the ceremonial heartland between the great locks. It's as if the same Orcadian genius for building in stone, which had found its domestic expression in the snug subterranean village, was now being turned towards a far grander and more cosmic purpose. The old stalled cairns, those long segmented houses for the ancestors, were a thing of the past. A new, more dramatic and intellectually sophisticated design had arrived. A design that was less about the collective lineage and more about a single, breathtaking moment of celestial theatre. This was the age of the Great Passage Grave and its supreme masterpiece, a structure of such precision and perfection that it feels less like a product of the Stone Age and more like a work of alien geometry, is the tomb known as Maishoe. From the outside, Maishoe looks deceptively simple. It's a large, perfectly smooth, grass-covered mound, a green, conical breast of earth rising from the flat Orcadian plain. It sits in the center of a wide circular platform, which is itself enclosed by a broad ditch and an outer bank, a henge, a sacred circle drawn around this holy place. There's a quiet, minimalist elegance to it. It doesn't shout its importance with jagged standing stones. It hums with a deep, contained power. But this gentle green exterior is just a weatherproof shell, a cladding of turf and earth over an internal stone structure that is one of the pinnacles of European prehistoric architecture. To approach the entrance is to begin a journey, not just into a tomb, but into a different kind of reality, a space where the rules of the ordinary world are suspended. The entrance passage is a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. It's over 10 meters long, but for most of its length, it is less than a meter high. To enter, you have no choice but to stoop low, to bow, to make yourself small and humble before the power of the place. You shuffle forward in a half-crouch through the cold, tight confines of the tunnel, the modern world of wind and sky left completely behind. Your senses deprived of everything but the feel of the cold stone and the sound of your own breathing in the enclosed space. The passage itself is a miracle of engineering. It's lined and roofed with single, colossal, perfectly dressed flagstones, some of them weighing several tons, fitted together with a precision that would impress a modern mason. This is not the simple, stacked slab construction of Skara Brae. This is megalithic architecture of the highest order. Then, just before you reach the central chamber, the passage becomes even tighter, forcing you to almost crawl through a section known as the warding stone, a final threshold before the great revelation. And then you emerge. You can stand up, straighten your back, and you find yourself in a space of perfect and breathtaking symmetry. You are in the heart of the mound, a central chamber that is an almost perfect cube, roughly 4.5 meters on each side. The walls are made of monumental, expertly worked slabs of sandstone, rising to a high corbelled roof, where successively smaller rings of stone create a kind of stone dome, a technique that demonstrates a profound understanding of structural physics. The quality of the stonework is sublime. The joints are so fine you could barely slip a knife blade between them. This is not a rough-hewn cave. It is a perfectly executed vault, a masterclass in masonry that feels thousands of years ahead of its time. Opening off this central chamber, on 3 of the 4 walls, are the dark, forbidding mouths of smaller side cells, each one originally sealed with a heavy plug-like stone block. This is where the bones of the honored dead would have been laid to rest. But the true genius of Maisho, the secret that elevates it from a mere tomb into a celestial observatory, is not its architecture, but its alignment. For most of the year, the interior is a place of absolute, impenetrable darkness. But the builders, those Neolithic astronomer priests, designed the whole monument around a few minutes of transcendent light. They oriented the long entrance passage with incredible precision, not to the north or south, but to a very specific point on the southwestern horizon. For a few weeks on either side of the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, as the sun gets very low in the sky, its last dying rays shine directly down the entire length of the passage. The light forms a brilliant, elongated rectangle that creeps across the floor of the central chamber, up the back wall, and for a few magical moments, perfectly illuminates the dark entrance to the rear cell. It is an act of engineered darkness, a structure designed to capture a single, sacred beam of light at the darkest moment of the year. What did it mean? This is the deep, tantalizing mystery. We can only imagine the scene. The community gathered outside in the cold, watching the winter sun sink towards the distant hills of the island of Hoi. Inside, in the pitch blackness of the tomb, perhaps a shaman or a chieftain waited. As the beam of light stabbed into the darkness, it would have been a sign of immense power and hope. The winter solstice is a turning point. The moment the sun dies and is reborn, the moment the days begin, imperceptibly at first, to lengthen again, promising the return of spring, the renewal of life. Was this ritual a way of ensuring that rebirth? Did the light, by touching the bones of the ancestors deep within their stone house, re-energize them, connect them to the great cosmic cycle of death and resurrection? Or was it a message for the dead, a signal to their spirits that the turning point had come? Whatever its precise meaning, it was a profound statement of belief, a belief that human life and death were inextricably woven into the grand eternal rhythms of the sun, the moon, and the stars. Mai Shui was not just a tomb. It was a clock, a calendar, and a gateway, a place where the worlds of the living, the dead, and the gods were brought into perfect, luminous alignment. The astonishing light-capturing perfection of Mai Shui was a kind of glorious dead end, a masterpiece so complete it could perhaps not be surpassed on its own terms. But the fundamental idea that pulsed at its heart, the power of the circle, the act of drawing a line in the earth to separate the sacred from the profane, was an idea that was about to break free from the dark, enclosed world of the tomb and step out into the open air. This concept, which had its tentative beginnings in the interrupted ditches of the old causewayed enclosures, and which found a potent expression in the ring of earth thrown around Mai Shui, was about to become the defining architectural grammar of the next 1,000 years. A new kind of monument began to appear, first in the innovative crucible of Orkney, and then spreading like a powerful new religion all across Britain. This was the henge, and with it, the focus of ceremony shifted from the enclosed, exclusive darkness of the ancestors' house to the wide, open-air theater of the living community. Now, the word henge is one of those archaeological terms that has been stretched and pulled so far out of shape that it's lost almost all its original meaning. We tend to call anything with a circle of big stones a henge, but that's not quite right. Stonehenge itself, ironically, isn't a technically perfect henge. The term, in its pure form, describes a very specific type of earthwork. Imagine you want to create a sacred circular space. The logical, defensive way to do it would be to dig a ditch and pile the earth up on the inside to create a protective wall, a rampart. This is how you build a fort. The henge builders did the exact opposite. They dug a deep, continuous ditch, and then they piled all of the earth and chalk up on the outside of the ditch, creating a high external bank. This is a design that is, from a military perspective, utterly comically useless. Any attacker would find the defenders conveniently trapped at the bottom of a ditch with a helpful ramp leading up to their own position. The design is a declaration of peaceful, or at least non-military, intent. The barrier it creates is not physical, but symbolic. The ditch and bank are not a wall to keep people out. They are a frame, a velvet rope, a line that says, when you cross this boundary, you are entering a different kind of space, a world within a world, where different rules apply. These new monuments began to pop up across the land, from the standing stones of Stennis in Orkney, one of the very earliest examples, down to the chalklands of southern England. They came in all shapes and sizes. Some were small, intimate circles, perhaps only 20 meters across, little more than a private chapel for a single community. Others were colossal, like the great circles at Avebury or Durrington Walls, which we will visit later. Vast amphitheaters that could have held thousands of people. The construction was the same familiar back-breaking work of the earlier earth movers, the relentless chipping and scraping with antler picks, the hauling of countless basket loads of spoil. But the effect was entirely new. Standing inside a henge, the world is transformed. The high bank on the outside blocks the view of the surrounding landscape, creating a contained artificial horizon. It isolates you from the mundane world of fields and farms, focusing your attention entirely on the events taking place within the circle and on the great open bowl of the sky above. It's an architecture of attention, designed to create an intense, almost theatrical experience for those privileged enough to be inside. The great mystery, of course, is what exactly that experience was. What were they doing in there? The external bank and internal ditch create a fascinating dynamic. The bank provides a natural viewing platform for people standing on the outside, looking down into the arena. The ditch creates a physical and symbolic separation between those spectators and the participants within the central platform. This has led to the compelling idea that henges were arenas for ritual drama. Perhaps this is where rites of passage took place, where young men and women were initiated into the secrets of the tribe. Perhaps they were the stages for great seasonal festivals, the Neolithic equivalent of Glastonbury, with feasting, music, and ceremony. Some of the ditches, particularly those dug into less porous ground, may have held water, at least for part of the year, creating a kind of moat, a shimmering, reflective circle that would have mirrored the sky and the standing stones or timber posts that were often erected inside, further enhancing the sense of a magical, otherworldly space. Many henges also seem to have been carefully aligned with the heavens. They frequently have just one or two formal entrances, causeways left undug across the ditch, and these entrances are often oriented towards the position of the sun or moon at a critical time of year, such as the midsummer sunrise or the midwinter sunset. This reinforces the idea that these were not just social spaces, but were also great open-air observatories, places where the community could gather to watch, to celebrate, and perhaps to feel they were participating in the great predictable cycles of the cosmos. The henge was a place where the human world and the celestial world could meet, a microcosm of the universe drawn upon the earth. It was a simple idea, a ditch and a bank, but it was endlessly adaptable, and it captured the imagination of late Neolithic Britain. It became the dominant form of public monument, the new blueprint for the sacred, a circular stage on which the final, most spectacular acts of the Stone Age were about to be played out. And so we travel south from the windy shores of Orkney, leaving behind the stone villages and the perfectly aligned tombs, and we come to rest in the vast rolling emptiness of Salisbury Plain in southern England. This was already an ancient and hallowed ground, a landscape etched with the faint lines of the great Cursus monuments and dotted with the long, silent humps of ancestral barrows. It was a place heavy with the memory of generations. And it was here, around 3000 BC, on a gentle, unremarkable slope, that a group of people decided to build their own henge, their own great circle. Their work would, in time, become the single most famous prehistoric monument on the entire planet, a name that resonates with a unique and powerful magic. But the monument they began was not the one we see in our mind's eye today. There were no mighty trilithons, no iconic sarsen stones silhouetted against the sunset. The first Stonehenge was a far humbler, and in many ways, more mysterious affair. A simple, gleaming white circle of earth, whose primary purpose was not to host the living, but to house the dead. The work began, as it did with all henges, with the familiar rhythmic scrape of antler picks against chalk. They dug a great circular ditch, nearly 100 meters in diameter. The spoil, the brilliant white, freshly quarried chalk, was piled up to form two low parallel banks, one on the inner and one on the outer edge of the ditch, a slightly unusual arrangement for a henge. In the bright southern sun, this new monument would have been a dazzling sight. A perfect, luminous white ring dropped onto the green turf of the plain, visible for miles in every direction. It was a statement, a new sacred center being declared in a landscape already crowded with the sacred. They left two entrances, a wide one to the northeast and a smaller one to the south. And it is through that northeastern entrance that the first hints of the monument's future astronomical obsession appear. A large, unworked sarsen stone, now known as the heel stone, was erected on this axis, some distance from the circle itself. It was placed so that a person standing in the center of the henge on the morning of the summer solstice would see the sun rise directly over its tip. The celestial clock was already being set, but the most peculiar feature of this first Stonehenge was not the ditch or the banks, but what was dug just inside them. The builders excavated a precise ring of 56 large circular pits, each about a meter deep, spaced with remarkable regularity around the inner edge of the bank. These have become known as the Aubrey Holes, named after the 17th century antiquarian John Aubrey, who first noticed them. And for centuries, the purpose of these pits has been one of Stonehenge's most stubborn enigmas. Were they sockets for a great circle of timber posts, a wooden predecessor to the later stone rings, a wood henge within a henge? It's a plausible idea, and for a long time It was the dominant theory, or as some have argued, were they the original sockets for the famous blue stones, the smaller stones that were brought all the way from Wales, which perhaps formed the very first stone circle on the site before being moved. The evidence for either theory is frustratingly ambiguous, but in recent years, a new and far more profound understanding of the Aubrey holes has emerged, and it has completely changed our perception of what this first monument was for. When archaeologists carefully re-excavated some of these pits, they found that a significant number of them contained not the ghosts of timber posts, but human remains. They were filled with the cremated bones of the dead. It turns out that this first great circle was not primarily a temple or an observatory, but one of the largest cemeteries of its time in Britain. The act of cremation itself was a powerful ritual. The body of the deceased would be placed on a great funeral pyre, and the entire community would have watched as the fire consumed the flesh, a dramatic, transformative process that reduced the physical body to a handful of calcined bone and ash. This was seen as a purification, a release of the spirit from its corruptible, fleshy prison. These remains were then carefully gathered up, perhaps placed in a leather or cloth bag, and carried to the sacred circle. Here, they were placed in a small hollow, dug into the fill of the Aubrey holes, or sometimes into the ditch and bank itself. Over a period of several centuries, it seems Stonehenge was the final resting place for an entire elite community. Estimates suggest that the remains of between 150 and 200 individuals, men, women, and even children, were interred here. This was not a graveyard for the common farmer. Analysis of the bones suggests these were people who were well-fed and did not engage in heavy manual labor. They were the elite, the ruling class, the priest kings, and their families. It seems that gaining a final resting place within this gleaming white circle was the ultimate mark of status. This turns our whole understanding of the monument on its head. The Great Henge was not built as a stage for rituals for the living, but as a bounded, sacred domain for the spirits of the most powerful ancestors. It was a city of the dead. This raises a fascinating new mystery. If the Aubrey holes were, from the beginning, intended as graves, why dig 56 of them in such a perfect, evenly spaced circle? Why not just dig a grave when you needed one? It suggests a grand preordained plan. Did the 56 holes represent the 56 founding families of the dynasty that built and controlled this sacred place, with each pit reserved for a particular lineage? Was there a ritual cycle where a different hole was used each year or each generation? We are staring at the faint outline of a complex social and religious system that is now completely lost to us. We see the hardware, the pits in the ground, but the software, the belief system that gave them meaning, has been wiped. What is certain is that for the first 500 years of its life, Stonehenge was a monument that looked inwards, to the bones and the spirits held within its chalky embrace, a silent, luminous white ring that held the collected power of the ancestors, while its single, lonely outlying stone patiently watched the horizon, waiting for the sun. For centuries, the great white ring of the first Stonehenge stood as a silent testament to the power of the ancestors, a closed circle for the spirits of the elite. But beyond the chalk downs, a new cultural wind was starting to blow, a restless, creative, and transformative energy that had been born in the most unlikely of places, that powerhouse of innovation we just visited in the far north, the Orkney Islands. This new movement had its own distinctive emblem, its own calling card, an object that would become the defining artifact of the late Neolithic. And like so many revolutions, it started with a simple piece of pottery. But this was a pot with a message, a pot that carried a whole new way of looking at the world. It was called grooved ware, and its appearance on the scene marks a profound break with the past, a moment when the old, quiet traditions were cast aside for something new, something bolder, and something altogether more communal. To understand the impact of grooved ware, you have to remember the pottery that came before it. That elegant, undecorated Crimston Lyle's hillware. Those pots were the epitome of quiet, minimalist good taste, all graceful curves and clean lines, like a piece of classic, mid-century modern design. Grooved ware was the absolute opposite. It was chunky, confident, and extravagantly, almost obsessively, decorated. These were not graceful bowls, but heavy, flat-bottomed, bucket-shaped pots, built to sit solidly on the ground, not nestle in the embers of a fire. And their entire surface was a canvas for the potter's art. Using a bone or flint tool, they would incise or groove complex geometric patterns into the wet clay before firing. Triangles, chevrons, spirals, and intricate panels of decoration that would have taken hours to complete. Sometimes they would apply strips of clay to the outside to create raised, chorded patterns. This was not quiet, functional pottery. This was loud pottery. This was statement pottery. If Crimston ware was a fine wine glass, grooved ware was a heavily decorated craft beer stein. It was designed to be seen, to be talked about, and to signify that its owner was part of something new. This new ceramic fashion first appears, unsurprisingly, in Orkney around 3200 BC, right at the moment of the island's great cultural flowering. It's the pottery you find littering the floors of the houses at Skara Brae and piled up in the middens of the great ceremonial complex at the Ness of Brodgar. It was their pot, born of their unique cultural moment. And for a time it stayed there. But then, sometime around 2800 BC, it began to spread. First to northern Scotland, and then, with remarkable speed, it swept down the entire length of Britain, all the way to the south coast, to the lands of the old Wessex elite who were still burying their cremated dead at Stonehenge. But grooved ware did not travel alone. It was the calling card for an entire cultural package, a suite of new ideas, technologies, and practices that came with it. It's as if it was the hardware for a whole new social and religious operating system. Where you find grooved ware, you also tend to find a new style of arrowhead, a beautiful and deadly design called a chisel-ended arrowhead. You find a new preference for building huge, open-air timber circles and henges, places for massive communal gatherings, rather than the old, secretive, chambered tombs. You find a new emphasis on the pig. At grooved ware sites, the bones of pigs suddenly become overwhelmingly common, suggesting that great feasts, where vast quantities of pork were roasted and consumed, were a central part of the new ritual. And you find new, enigmatic forms of portable art, like those strange, intricately carved stone balls we mentioned, objects of no known practical function, but of immense symbolic power. This wasn't just a new pot, it was a whole new lifestyle choice. This brings us to the great historiographical mystery. Who were the grooved ware people? And how did their culture spread so comprehensively and so quickly from the remote Northern Isles to the very heart of the Southern establishment? Was this a migration of people, a wave of Orcadian colonists and missionaries who moved south, bringing their religion and their pots with them? While there may have been some movement of people, the genetic evidence doesn't support a massive island-wide population replacement. The alternative is that this was a movement of ideas, not of people. This is where the theory of grooved ware as the material culture of a new religious movement becomes so compelling. Perhaps this was a kind of Neolithic cult or spiritual awakening that offered an alternative to the old, ancestor-focused, lineage-based religions of the long barrow builders. This new creed was perhaps more open, more communal, more focused on celebrating life, the seasons, and the cosmos through great inclusive public ceremonies involving feasting and spectacle in the new henges. Owning a grooved ware pot was your badge of membership, your signal that you had joined this exciting new movement. It was a social contagion, a powerful set of ideas that went viral, spreading from community to community, not through conquest, but through conversion. It was a choice people made to abandon the traditions of their forefathers and sign up for a new, dynamic, and perhaps more egalitarian way of being. A way of being that was about the circle of the living, not just the house of the dead. And this powerful new ideology was about to arrive on Salisbury Plain, where it would find its ultimate canvas for expression and transform the quiet cemetery of Stonehenge into something else entirely. This new, boisterous, pot-decorating, pork-loving culture needed a capital, a place to put its revolutionary ideas into practice on the grandest possible scale. And so, just 2 miles northeast of the old, quiet, ancestral circle of Stonehenge, a new and vibrant metropolis of the living sprang up, almost overnight. It was called Durrington Walls, and if Stonehenge was the solemn stone-built cathedral for the dead, Durrington Walls was the sprawling, chaotic, timber-built festival city for the living. It wasn't just a settlement. It was a statement of intent, the physical headquarters of the grooved ware cultural revolution, and very likely the place that the builders of Stonehenge, in its greatest and most iconic phase, called home. To approach Durrington Walls in its heyday, around 2500 BC, would have been an overwhelming sensory experience. The first thing that would have hit you, long before you saw it, was the smell. A thick, permanent haze of wood smoke from 1,000 hearths, mingled with the rich, mouth-watering aroma of roasting pork, the earthy scent of the nearby river, and the pungent smell of a huge concentration of people and livestock. The scale of the place was immense. Like the monuments of the past, it was defined by a henge, but this was a henge on steroids. It enclosed a colossal area of over 30 acres, making it one of the very largest in Britain. But unlike the empty ceremonial henges of old, this one was crammed with life. Inside its great chalk bank, archaeologists have found the ghostly footprints of up to 1,000 small square houses, each with its own central hearth, floor fittings, and the scattered detritus of daily life. This was no sleepy village. This was a bustling, densely populated town, a temporary city whose population may have swelled to several thousand people at peak construction times. It was a builder's camp, an Olympic village, and a pilgrimage site all rolled into one, a place of intense, focused, and probably very noisy activity. And at the heart of this sprawling settlement stood not one, but two enormous and mysterious timber monuments. The most impressive, known as the Southern Circle, was a monumental structure consisting of 6 concentric rings of massive oak posts, some of which would have been the size of mature trees. It was an architectural feat to rival anything being built in stone, a great open-air temple of wood, likely roofed over to create a vast, shadowy rotunda for indoor ceremonies. A paved avenue flanked by more timber posts led from its entrance down to the banks of the River Avon, creating a formal processional way connecting the world of the living at Durrington Walls with the river, which in turn flowed down towards the domain of the dead at Stonehenge. The entire landscape was being woven together into a single, complex ritual tapestry. The river was the artery that connected the two great centers, and journeys along it must have been a key part of the ceremonies that governed life and death. But the most spectacular evidence to come out of Durrington Walls, the clue that truly brings this lost world to life, is the sheer mind-boggling quantity of animal bones. This was a city that ran on meat. The middens are overflowing with the remains of cattle and, above all, pigs, tens of thousands of them. And these were not just the remains of everyday meals. The pattern of butchery is very specific. The bones are mostly from prime, young adult pigs, killed at their peak, and they show evidence of being roasted whole on spits, not boiled down in pots. Furthermore, analysis of the isotopes in the pig's teeth, which act as a chemical signature of the geology where they grew up, has revealed something astonishing. These pigs were not local. They weren't raised on Salisbury Plain. They had been brought here, on the hoof, from almost every corner of Britain, from Wales, from northeast England, even from as far away as Scotland. This is the smoking gun, the undeniable proof of what was happening here. Durrington Walls was the site of the biggest barbecue in British prehistory. It was a place of monumental, island-wide feasting. This is where the mystery deepens. What was the purpose of these colossal feasts? Were they simply a way to feed the army of workers who were toiling on the great sarsen stones of Stonehenge just down the river? Was a haunch of roasted pork their payment, their wage for a hard season of labor? This is the pragmatic explanation. But the sheer scale of it, the fact that the pigs were brought from so far away, suggests something more, something profoundly ritualistic. Perhaps the feast was the ritual itself. Perhaps different communities from across the island were obliged or felt a powerful religious urge to bring their finest pigs to this great central gathering, a kind of sacred tribute. To contribute a pig and participate in the feast was a way of binding yourself to this great communal project, of earning your stake in what was happening at the center of the world. It was a religious pilgrimage that culminated in a massive, unifying act of consumption, forging social bonds and a shared identity through the communal experience of the feast. We can imagine the scene. The great fires roaring, the air thick with smoke and the sound of chanting, thousands of people gathered within the great timber circles, their faces slick with pork fat, caught up in a moment of ecstatic, religious communion. This was the vibrant, chaotic, and very well-fed world that provided the human engine for the most ambitious building project the island had ever seen. A project that was about to find its ultimate, eternal expression in stone. That great smoky feasting city of Durrington Walls was not just a chaotic sprawl of builders' huts. At its heart, as we've seen, were those two immense timber monuments, the southern and northern circles, vast assertions of architectural ambition that rivaled anything being built in stone. It's easy for us, with our modern bias towards the enduring power of stone, to see these wooden structures as somehow secondary, as temporary scaffolding for the real monument being built down the river. But that would be a profound misreading of the beliefs of the grooved ware people. For them, wood was not a lesser material. It was a different material, with its own potent living magic, and the great timber circles were not sideshows. They were the main event, the vibrant, breathing counterparts to the cold, silent permanence of stone. They were the wooden soul of this new world. Imagine the effort involved in creating the southern circle at Durrington. First, the search for the trees themselves. This wasn't just a matter of chopping down any old wood. It required the selection of hundreds of ancient, perfectly straight oak trees, true giants of the dwindling wildwood, each one a living being that had stood for centuries. Felling these behemoths with stone axes, trimming their branches, and then hauling them, presumably with teams of oxen and human muscle, across miles of landscape to the building site was a logistical challenge of the highest order. Then came the engineering. The surveyors laid out 6 perfect concentric rings of post holes, a dizzying geometric pattern that would have been staked out with ropes and pegs. The great pits were dug, and then, with immense coordinated effort, the massive posts, each weighing several tons, were levered and pulled upright and set into the ground. The final structure would have been an awe-inspiring spectacle, a dense, man-made forest, a colossal wooden cage that dominated the skyline. Standing inside, you would have been enveloped by the sheer physical presence of the wood, the rough texture of the bark, the deep, earthy smell of the oak, the way the sound of chanting or drumming would have echoed and been absorbed by the hundreds of vertical trunks. It would have felt powerful, organic, and intensely alive. Just a short walk from the main enclosure of Durrington Walls lies another smaller but equally significant site that has come to be known quite simply as Woodhenge. For centuries, its existence was completely unknown, its memory erased from the landscape, until an aerial photograph taken in the 1920s revealed a curious pattern of dark spots in a farmer's crop, the telltale signs of ancient buried post holes. When excavated, it was revealed to be a near-perfect miniature of the great timber circles at its larger neighbor. It consisted of 6 concentric oval rings of timber posts, enclosed by a henge ditch and bank, its entrance aligned just like the greater Stonehenge. On the midsummer solstice sunrise, a child's grave was found buried right at the center, a poignant, dedicatory offering at the heart of the structure. Woodhenge was not a settlement. It was a purely ceremonial space, a timber temple that stood as an integral part of this sprawling sacred landscape. This brings us to the great intellectual puzzle, the deep mystery that lies at the heart of the Stonehenge landscape. What was the relationship between wood and stone? Was it a simple case of pragmatism, using wood at Durrington because it was closer to the forests of the Avon Valley, and stone at Stonehenge because it was on the open plain? Or was there a far deeper, more symbolic duality at play? The most compelling and beautiful theory is that the choice of material was a conscious philosophical statement. Wood, the theory goes, was the medium of the living. It is organic, it is warm to the touch, and it is transient. A house is built of wood, it serves a generation or two, and then it decays, rots, and returns to the earth from whence it came. It mirrors the cycle of human life. Stone, on the other hand, is the medium of the ancestors. It is cold, hard, and eternal. It does not decay. A tomb built of stone is built to last forever, a permanent home for the spirits of the dead. In this light, the entire landscape around Stonehenge becomes a grand symbolic map of life and death. Durrington Walls, the great city of timber houses and huge wooden circles, was the domain of the living. It was a place of noisy, messy, vibrant life, of feasting and celebration. Stonehenge, the great circle of immortal stone, was the domain of the dead, a place of silence, solemnity, and ancestral power. And the River Avon, which connects the two, was the great threshold, the artery of transition. We can imagine the funeral processions. A great leader dies at Durrington. Their body is celebrated with a final feast in the southern circle, the great wooden temple of the living. Then the body, or perhaps the cremated remains, would be carried down that formal avenue to the river's edge and placed on a ceremonial barge. The boat would then float downstream, a slow final journey from the world of wood to the world of stone, where the spirit would take its final place among the eternal ancestors at Stonehenge. It is a breathtakingly coherent vision, a society that had externalized its entire cosmology, writing its beliefs about the journey of the soul into the very fabric of the landscape, creating a pair of magnificent twin monuments, one for life in the wood that decays, and one for death in the stone that endures. The great wooden temples at Durrington Walls were the vibrant, beating heart of the living, a place of feasting and ceremony that pulsed with a vibrant, transient energy. But the belief system that fueled this city of wood also demanded its opposite, an eternal house for the ancestors, a place of silent, everlasting stone. The old henge, the quiet cremation cemetery on the plain, was about to be utterly transformed, upgraded from a simple circle of earth into a true temple of stone. And for this, the builders would not use the local rock that lay scattered across the downlands. They required something special, something other, a stone with a deeper magic, a more ancient story. They needed a stone that would have to be brought to them across a near impossible distance, in an act of faith and labor so extreme that it has become one of the greatest legends of prehistoric Britain. This was the beginning of the bluestone conundrum. The bluestones are the smaller stones of the Stonehenge complex, and they are, geologically speaking, complete and utter aliens to the chalky landscape of Salisbury Plain. The name itself is a touch of poetic license. They aren't all vividly blue, but many of them, particularly the spotted tollerite, take on a bluish-grey hue when they are wet or freshly broken, and are flecked with beautiful white crystals of feldspar that look like a star chart trapped in the rock. For centuries, their origin was a complete mystery, fodder for wild theories involving Merlin, the magician, spiriting them over from Ireland. But in the 20th century, the new magic of geochemistry provided the answer by analyzing the precise mineral composition of the stones at Stonehenge and comparing it to rock outcrops all over Britain. Scientists were able to pinpoint their geological DNA. The source was not local, not even close. The bluestones were quarried from a very specific set of craggy tors in the Prehistory Hills of Pembrokeshire, in the far southwest of Wales. This means that at least 80 of these stones, some weighing as much as 4 tons, were transported over land and sea, a journey of at least 180 miles, or 290 kilometers. It is an act of logistics, of sheer, bloody-minded determination that is difficult for us to comprehend even now. Let's just pause and try to visualize that journey. First, the quarrying. At sites like Carn Godog in the Prehistory Hills, archaeologists have found evidence of the Neolithic quarry workers in action. They didn't have explosives or steel tools. They worked with the natural fractures in the rock, hammering in wooden wedges and then pouring water on them, so that the swelling wood would crack the great pillars of stone away from the rock face. Then, the real work began. The multi-ton monoliths had to be lowered from the high, rocky tors down to the valleys below. They were likely moved on a combination of wooden rollers and sledges, lubricated with animal fat, a painfully slow process requiring hundreds of people pulling on hide ropes, chanting, and heaving in unison, their movements perhaps directed by a priest or a foreman standing on the stone itself. Then came the journey overland, across the rugged hilly terrain of West Wales, until they reached the sea. Here, the stones would have been loaded onto some kind of vessel. We can only imagine what these prehistoric cargo ships looked like. Perhaps huge catamaran-style rafts made by lashing together several dugout canoes, or great hide-covered currachs built on a massive scale. Then came the most perilous stage, the sea voyage. They would have had to navigate the treacherous waters of the Bristol Channel, a place of fierce tides and unpredictable weather. Hugging the coastline, they would have eventually entered the mouth of the River Avon, and then began the long, slow upstream haul against the current, before the final, grueling overland drag from the riverbank up onto Salisbury Plain. The entire undertaking would have been a multi-generational project, a sacred duty that might have taken decades to complete. And it was all powered by the social energy we saw at Durrington Walls, the feasting, the shared belief, the immense social cohesion that could persuade people from across the island to contribute their labor and their pigs to this single, unifying, monumental goal. But was this truly how it happened? Herein lies the great debate, the central mystery of the Bluestones. While the evidence for the human haulage theory is strong, there is an alternative and rather mischievous hypothesis. What if nature did most of the hard work? This is the glacial transport theory. It suggests that during the last ice age, a great glacier scoured its way down the Irish Sea, scraped a chunk off the Prehistory Hills, and carried the Bluestones, like pebbles in a stream, all the way to Wiltshire, conveniently dumping them somewhere near Salisbury Plain as the ice melted, thousands of years before the henge builders even arrived. In this version of the story, the Neolithic people were not epic long-distance haulers, but clever opportunists who found a collection of magical, exotic stones already lying in their backyard and decided to use them. It's a tempting idea, but it has one major flaw. If a glacier carried the Bluestones, it should have carried a whole suite of other Welsh rocks with it, and yet we find no other glacial erratics from Pembrokeshire on Salisbury Plain. The current consensus has swung firmly back to the human transport theory. But the debate still lingers, and that leaves us with the deepest question of all. Why Why on earth go to all that trouble for these specific stones? It can't have been for their size. The local sarsen stones are far bigger. There must have been something profoundly special about them. One theory points to the long association of the Prehistory region with healing springs and holy wells. Perhaps the stones themselves were believed to possess curative powers, and Stonehenge was conceived as a great center for healing, a prehistoric lords, where people would come to be cured of their ailments by the magical power of the stones. Another powerful idea is that the people who orchestrated this new phase of building were themselves migrants from Wales. Perhaps their ancestral homeland was Preseli, and in moving the stones, they were literally transplanting their heritage, bringing their ancient sacred monuments with them to their new center of power. Finally, there is the intriguing fact that some of the blue stones are lithophones. When you strike them, they ring with a clear metallic bell-like tone. Perhaps their acoustic properties were the key, and Stonehenge was designed as a great musical instrument, a stone carillon whose resonant chimes were a vital part of the rituals performed there, their sound echoing out across the silent plain. Whatever the reason, healing, ancestry, or sound, the journey of these Welsh stones represents an umbilical cord, a physical link that tied the sacred center of Wessex to a remote and magical mountain range, a testament to a belief so powerful it could literally move mountains. The arrival of the Welsh bluestones was a feat of almost mythical proportions, a testament to a belief that could command the landscape and the sea. But their placement on Salisbury Plain was not the final act. It was merely the overture. The bluestones, with their ancient, healing, bell-like magic, were the sacred heart of the project. But the architects of this new age dreamed on a scale that demanded a body of almost unimaginable size and strength to contain that heart. The grand vision required a new kind of stone, a stone of colossal power, a stone that would be sourced not from a distant magical mountain, but from the local downlands, a monster that had been waiting patiently just over the horizon. This was the age of the Sarsens. Sarsen stone is the polar opposite of the elegant foreign bluestone. It is a type of silicified sandstone, an incredibly hard, dense, and unforgiving rock formed from ancient sand deposits. It is the remnant of a cap of rock that once covered the chalk downs, and it survives today as huge, isolated boulders, lying semi-buried in the landscape like a herd of sleeping grey elephants. The best and largest of these boulders were to be found on the Marlborough Downs, about 20 miles north of Stonehenge. And when I say large, I mean truly gargantuan. The biggest Sarsen stone brought to Stonehenge, the mighty central upright of the Great Trilithon, weighs an estimated 50 tons. That is the equivalent of a fully grown humpback whale, or 30 modern family cars. The journey of the bluestones was a triumph of distance. The journey of the Sarsens was a brutal, bare-knuckle fight against pure naked mass. The logistics of moving even one of these behemoths beggar belief. There was no sea route, no convenient river to help with the load. This was a 20-mile overland slog, up and down the rolling hills of Wiltshire. The journey would have taken months, perhaps even years, for a single stone. We can only imagine the scene, a vision of raw, organized, human power that seems to belong more to the building of the pyramids. The great stone would be painstakingly prized from the ground and levered onto a massive wooden sledge. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of people would then have been marshaled to pull on thick, plaited hide ropes, their feet slipping in the chalky mud, their bodies straining in unison, their progress measured in inches per day. Great tracks of logs would have been laid down in front of the sledge to act as rollers, which would then be picked up from behind and carried to the front in a continuous, exhausting cycle. This was the final spectacular outpouring of the social energy that was being generated at Durrington Walls. The great big roasts were the fuel, the religious fervor was the motivation, and the result was this slow, inexorable procession of grey giants across the landscape, a project of such staggering ambition that it must have seemed to anyone watching like the gods themselves were rearranging the world. But the true miracle of this final phase of Stonehenge was not the transport, it was the stonework. These were not just crude, unworked boulders erected in their natural state. The builders treated the intractable sarsen stone as if it were a piece of fine cabinetry. They were determined not just to build a circle, but to create a masterpiece of architectural joinery. First, each stone was meticulously dressed. Using heavy, rounded hammerstones called mauls, teams of masons would have spent thousands of hours systematically pounding the rough, weathered surface of the boulder, chipping off flake after flake to create a smooth, surprisingly regular finish. We can still see the rippling patterns of their work on the stones today, a tactile record of their immense patience. Then came the truly revolutionary part. They decided to join the stones together, using techniques borrowed directly from woodworking, to secure the great lintels that would sit atop the uprights of the outer circle and the inner trilithons. They carved protruding knobs or tenons on the top of each upright stone. They then carved corresponding hollows or mortises into the underside of the lintels so that the two would slot together perfectly, like a giant, indestructible piece of Lego. This was an incredible feat of precision engineering, ensuring the lintels could never slip off. But they didn't stop there. For the continuous ring of lintels on the outer circle, they wanted them to lock together sideways as well. So they carved a vertical tongue down one side of each lintel and a corresponding groove down the other, so that they interlocked seamlessly. They even introduced subtle optical refinements that would have made a Greek architect proud 2,000 years later. The uprights are not perfectly straight. They have a slight, almost imperceptible bulge in the middle and taper towards the top, a trick of entasis that counteracts the optical illusion of them looking thinner in the middle, making them appear straighter and more powerful. The lintels of the outer circle are not perfectly flat either. They are gently curved, so that when joined together, they form a perfect, smooth circle. This was not just building. This was sculpture on a monumental scale, an obsessive pursuit of geometric perfection. Finally, the stones were raised. A deep pit would be dug, and with hundreds of people pulling on ropes from one side, while others used massive timber levers on the other, the multi-ton upright would be tipped into its hole and hauled into a vertical position. Raising the lintels, some 30 tons each, 7 meters into the air, was an even greater challenge. They would have had to build enormous timber scaffold towers, or slowly, painstakingly, inch the great stones upwards on a rising stack of timber cribs. And so the final, iconic form of Stonehenge took shape, a perfect, continuous outer circle of 30 dressed sarsen uprights, crowned with their seamlessly joined lintels. And inside this, a majestic inner horseshoe of 5 freestanding trilithons, 2 uprights, and a lintel, each one taller than the last, culminating in the great trilithon that towered over the central axis. The little Welsh bluestones, the ancient magical travelers, were then carefully rearranged inside this new Sarsen frame, their sacred status acknowledged by their placement at the very heart of this new cosmic temple. This was the culmination of everything that had gone before, a structure of overwhelming power and breathtaking sophistication, the final unrepeatable masterpiece of Neolithic Britain, a silent stone giant built to watch the sun and the moon for eternity. For a few generations, a profound and deceptive stillness must have settled over the heart of Wessex. The great Sarsen circle of Stonehenge was complete, a monument of such breathtaking ambition and power that it must have seemed like the final unanswerable word in a conversation that had been going on for 1,000 years. The city of the living at Durrington Walls, its purpose fulfilled, slowly emptied out, its great timber posts left to rot and return to the earth. The energy of an entire island had been poured into this one astonishing project, and now it stood, a silent grey giant, its geometric perfection a testament to the absolute zenith of the grooved ware people's world. Their cosmology was written in stone, their society was bound by the great feasts, their power was absolute. From their perspective, standing at the center of their magnificent creation, it must have felt as if they had built something that would last forever, an order that was as eternal and unchanging as the slow celestial dance of the sun and the moon above them. But they were wrong. Even as the last lintel was being raised, a new idea, a new technology, and a new kind of person were already making their quiet arrival on the shores of Britain, carrying with them a cultural package that would not just change the world, but end it. The first sign of this profound shift was, as it so often is in prehistory, a simple clay pot. But it was a pot of a kind never before seen in Britain, a vessel so distinctive and so elegant that it immediately stands out in the archaeological record. It was called a beaker. Unlike the heavy, bucket-shaped, flat-bottomed grooved ware that was designed for communal feasting, the beaker was a personal object. It was a finely made, S-shaped drinking vessel with a flared rim and a delicate curved belly, perfectly shaped to be held in 2 hands. And it was exquisitely decorated, not with deep grooves, but with intricate, complex patterns made by pressing a toothed comb or a twisted cord into the wet clay, creating zones of herringbone, chevrons, and lattices that covered the entire surface. This was not a communal beer stein. This was a personal goblet, a piece of high-status tableware. And the beaker pot did not arrive alone. Just as grooved ware had been the calling card for a whole cultural system, the beaker was the flagship product for a new and even more potent brand identity. This beaker package included other signature items, a new style of exquisitely crafted, barbed and tanged arrowhead that was a marvel of flint-knapping artistry, mysterious polished stone wrist guards or bracers thought to protect an archer's arm from the snap of the bowstring, and small V-perforated buttons made of jet or amber. But the package also contained something that was utterly game-changingly new, something that would sound the death knell for the Stone Age. It included the first metals. Tucked into the graves of these new arrivals were small, tanged copper daggers, their blades a strange, dull green with corrosion and sometimes exquisitely delicate ornaments worked from the soft, gleaming, magical metal that never tarnishes, gold. This was the dawn of metallurgy, the beginning of a technological revolution that would reshape the very foundations of power and society. For a very long time, the central debate was, did a new pot mean a new people? For much of the 20th century, the answer was a confident yes, in a theory known as the Beaker folk invasion. Boatloads of beaker-using warriors, the story went, arrived from the continent and conquered the simple henge builders. Then archaeology, in its typically revisionist fashion, swung the other way. Perhaps there was no invasion. Perhaps this was just a beaker package, a fashionable set of new ideas, technologies, and beliefs, a kind of high-status cult that spread peacefully among the existing Neolithic population who simply adopted these new status symbols. It's a much gentler, more appealing narrative. But then came the revolution in ancient DNA, and it has, with shocking clarity, swung the pendulum almost all the way back. The genetic evidence is now overwhelming. Around 2400 BC, at the very moment the beakers appear, there was a massive and relatively swift shift in the genetic makeup of the British population. New DNA, tracing its origins to the steppe grasslands of Eastern Europe via Central Europe, arrived in Britain. Within a few centuries, this new genetic signature had replaced an astonishing 90% of the indigenous gene pool, the lineage of the people who had cleared the forests, built the long barrows, and raised Stonehenge. This brings us face to face with the profound and unsettling mystery of this transition. If 90% of the existing population was replaced, how did this happen? The archaeological record shows no signs of a widespread genocidal war. So what was the mechanism of this near-total replacement? One chilling possibility is disease. The newcomers may have brought with them a strain of plague, Yersinia pestis, to which the native Neolithic population had no immunity, causing a catastrophic demographic collapse. Or perhaps it was a more complex process of social and economic dominance. The Beaker people, with their networks of trade that brought exotic materials like copper and gold, their mastery of a new and deadly form of archery, and perhaps even a new language, the ancestor of Celtic tongues, may have simply outcompeted the old grooved-ware elite. They may have established themselves as a new ruling class, taking the best land and controlling the new prestige economy, leading to the gradual decline and absorption of the old population over many generations. And this new order had a completely different philosophy. They abandoned the great communal henges and the collective tombs of the ancestors. Theirs was a new, heroic, individualistic creed. When a great Beaker chieftain died, they were not mixed into a communal bone house. They were buried alone in a single grave under a new individual monument, the Round Barrow, and they were sent into the afterlife accompanied by their personal possessions, their beaker, their dagger, their bow. The age of the collective was over. The age of the individual had begun, and the great stone circles, their purpose now forgotten by a new people, speaking a new language and worshipping new gods, were left to fall silent. And so the old world fell silent. The great stones of the final Stonehenge, which had been the focus of so much energy, so much faith, now stood untended, their purpose slowly fading from the memory of a new people who buried their dead alone under simple mounds of earth, their hands clutching a personal drinking cup and a sharp copper dagger. But before we consign the builders of the great circles entirely to the past, we must turn our attention to one last aspect of their world, an element so abstract, so mysterious, and so profoundly alien to our way of thinking that it is perhaps the hardest part of their story to grasp. We have talked of their architecture, their industry, and their rituals, but we have not yet spoken of their art, and this was not an art of representation, of pretty pictures of the world around them. The Neolithic artist was not interested in drawing a deer or a cow. Their canvas was the stone itself, and their subject matter was the geometry of the soul. All across the Neolithic world, but particularly concentrated in the great ceremonial landscapes of Ireland's Boyne Valley, the Kilmartin Glen in Scotland, and on the stones of Orkney, we find this strange and beautiful visual language. It is a vocabulary of pure form, a set of recurring motifs carved, pecked, and incised into the surfaces of both the great monuments and the natural living rock of the landscape. The simplest and most common of these symbols is the cup mark, a simple circular depression, like a shallow bowl pecked into the stone. They appear everywhere, sometimes in ones and twos, sometimes in vast star-like constellations covering an entire rock face. From this basic unit, the grammar expands. Sometimes the cup mark is enclosed by one or several concentric rings, creating the beautiful and hypnotic cup and ring mark. Then there are the other great motifs, the dizzying inward coiling spiral, the repeating zigzag pattern of the chevron, the diamond shape of the lozenge, and complex net-like patterns of lines. This was not graffiti, scratched onto the stones as an afterthought. It was an integral part of their design. At the great passage tombs of the Boyne Valley, like Newgrange and Noath, which belong to the same cultural world that produced Maeshowe and Stonehenge, the most important stones, the great curbstones that line the base of the mound, or the structural orthostats deep within the chambers, are covered in this art. The famous entrance stone at Newgrange is a masterpiece, a flowing tri-spiral design that seems to ripple out across the surface of the rock. In many cases, the art was carved onto the stone before it was erected, with parts of the design disappearing into the ground or being turned to face the back of the wall, hidden from view for all eternity. This tells us something profound. The art was not just for human eyes. The very act of carving it, of inscribing these powerful symbols into the fabric of the monument, was the important thing. It was a way of charging the stone with a specific power, of embedding a meaning within it that would be active whether anyone could see it or not. But what, in the name of all that is holy, did it mean? This is perhaps the greatest, most impenetrable mystery of the entire Neolithic period. We are looking at a complex, widespread, and clearly understood symbolic system, a kind of visual scripture, but we have lost the dictionary. We are functionally illiterate in the face of their most direct form of communication, and all we can do is guess. The theories are as numerous as the cup marks themselves. Could they be maps? Perhaps the cup and ring marks represent settlements, with the outer rings being their defensive ditches scattered across a landscape represented by the rock face. Could they be star charts, maps of the constellations that wheeled over their heads each night? Some of the patterns certainly have a celestial feel, but no one has ever been able to convincingly match them to any known star pattern. A more recent and incredibly compelling theory takes us into the strange world of neuroscience. This is the entoptic phenomenon hypothesis. Entoptic means within the vision, and it refers to the geometric patterns that are generated by the hard wiring of our own brains, by our own optic nerves, when we are in an altered state of consciousness. If you close your eyes and press gently on your eyelids, you see swirls and grids of light. In states of deep trance, induced by sensory deprivation, like sitting in the pitch black of a tomb for hours, rhythmic drumming and chanting, extreme fatigue, or perhaps the use of hallucinogenic mushrooms, the brain begins to produce a very specific set of visual hallucinations, spirals, zigzags, dots, grids, and meandering lines. These are not culturally determined. They are a biological universal, a product of the human nervous system. The theory suggests that the Neolithic shaman or priest would journey into the spirit world through one of these methods, and the patterns they carved onto the stones were a literal clinical record of what they saw on their journey. The art is not a picture of the world. It's a picture of the inside of a mind as it travels to another reality. It is the art of the trip. This idea is incredibly powerful. It explains why the art is abstract, why it is hidden away in the darkness of the tombs, and why the same limited set of motifs appears in different cultures all over the world. It frames the great monuments not just as tombs or observatories, but as portals, as launchpads for these shamanic journeys. The carvings become the tripwires, the triggers, the instruction manuals for how to navigate the terrifying and beautiful landscape of the inner mind. To trace the spiral with your finger in the flickering lamplight was to begin the process of trance, to follow the shaman's path into the other world. Of course, we can never know for sure. The meaning may have been something else entirely, a symbolic language of kinship, or a way of marking the flow of water, or a story whose narrative is now lost to us. But what is certain is that this was a society that was deeply engaged with the abstract, with the power of the symbol, and with the reality that lay beyond the veil of the mundane world. Their art is the final, silent, beautiful testament to a mindset that we have lost, a whisper from the other side of the door of perception, a riddle carved in stone, that strange, hypnotic, and ultimately indecipherable art, with its spirals and its zigzags, is the closest we will ever get to a direct message from the people of Neolithic Britain. It is a visual echo of a mind that saw the world in a fundamentally different way. And as we stand back and look at the whole vast tapestry we have explored, from the first clearings in the forest to the final perfect geometry of Stonehenge, we can begin to see the threads of that worldview, the great recurring patterns of belief that must have driven them to move mountains, chart the stars, and speak with their dead. We have no sacred texts, no gospels or sagas written down for us. All we have is the architecture of their faith, the cathedrals without the prayer books. And so, we must become reverse engineers of the soul, trying to reconstruct the belief system that could possibly have motivated such a world. The first and most powerful pillar of this lost religion, the bedrock on which everything else was built, was an intense and active relationship with the dead. For us, in our modern secular world, death is largely an ending, a private sorrow, and the dead are a memory. For the people of the Neolithic, the dead did not go away. They simply changed their state of being. They became ancestors, and the ancestors were a powerful, ever-present, and deeply influential part of the community. Remember those long barrows, those great, silent houses of bone? They were not just cemeteries, they were embassies. They were the places where the worlds of the living and the dead could meet. The careful curation of the bones, the mixing of individuals into a single, collective whole, the special treatment of skulls. This all points to a belief that the lineage, the clan, was an unbroken chain stretching from the distant past into the far future. The ancestors were the guarantors of the community's right to its land. We are here, the barrows seem to say, because they are here. We farm this land because their very bones are mixed with its soil. Access to the tomb, the right to enter that dark, sacred space and commune with the bones, was likely the ultimate source of political and spiritual power for the chieftains and priests. It was their hotline to the forces that truly governed the world. The second great pillar, intertwined with the first, was a profound and deeply observant relationship with the sky. These were farmers, after all, and their lives were governed by the great, predictable rhythms of the cosmos. The turning of the seasons, the waxing and waning of the moon, the life-giving journey of the sun. These were not abstract astronomical phenomena. They were the sacred pulse of the world. And so, they built their beliefs into their monuments. Remember Maishui, that masterpiece of engineered darkness, built to capture a single sacred beam of the midwinter sun. And Stonehenge, its axis aligned with the solstices, a great, eternal clock built to mark the turning points of the year. This was not science in our sense of the word. It was a religion of the sky. The sun was likely a powerful deity whose death at the winter solstice was a time of great anxiety and whose rebirth was the cause for the most important celebration of the year. Perhaps the very reason for the great feasts at Durrington Walls. The moon, with its more complex and mysterious cycle, may have been seen as another deity, perhaps governing the tides, the rain, or the fertility of women. The great stone circles were not just observatories. They were theaters for this cosmic drama, places where the community could gather to watch, to participate in, and they likely believed, to ensure the continuation of these vital cycles through their rituals. Putting these two ideas together, the power of the ancestors below and the power of the cosmos above, we begin to see a beautifully structured, dualistic worldview. This is the great hypothesis that brings so much of this world into focus. We saw it most clearly in the relationship between Durrington Walls and Stonehenge, the great timber city of the living and the eternal stone home of the dead, linked by the transitional artery of the river. This suggests a cosmology that was built on powerful oppositions: wood for the transient world of the living, stone for the eternal world of the ancestors, light and life in the east where the sun is born, darkness and death in the west where it dies, the upper world of the sky, the middle world of the land, and the underworld of the earth. Their entire landscape was a sacred map of these beliefs. The Cursus avenues may have been the formal pathways between these different realms. The art itself, with its spirals and chevrons, may have been a visual representation of these journeys, a map for the soul as it traveled from the world of wood to the world of stone, from life to ancestry. And finally, there was a belief in the power of the earth itself, in the spirits of place. Remember the offerings left in the darkness of the flint mines, the little chalk goddess placed before a pile of perfect antlers. This was a recognition that the earth was not just a dead resource to be exploited, but a living entity, a chthonic power that had to be respected, placated, and negotiated with. The quarrying of the bluestones from their special mountain home was likely seen as a sacred act, releasing a power that had been dormant in the rock. The very act of building, of cutting into the skin of the earth to dig a henge ditch or lay the foundations of a tomb, was probably accompanied by rituals of appeasement. It is a profoundly holistic worldview, a web of belief in which everything was connected. The people, the land they farmed, the ancestors buried within it, and the sun and moon that governed it all. It was a world alive with power and meaning, a world in which a simple clay pot could be a revolutionary technology, and a circle of grey stones could be the center of the entire universe. And so, the new order asserted itself, not with the thunderous crash of a collapsing trilithon, but with the quiet, insistent digging of a single grave. The change was profound, a revolution in the very concept of what it meant to be a person, what it meant to die, and what you left behind. The great communal projects, the henges and the stone circles that had been the supreme expression of the collective will for 1,000 years, had required a society that believed its strength lay in the whole, in the lineage, in the subsuming of the individual into the great eternal stream of ancestry. But the Beaker people arrived with a different story, a heroic epic with a single protagonist. Their world was not about the anonymous we. It was about the celebrated I, and the most powerful evidence for this new philosophy was the way they treated their dead. The age of the great monuments faded, and the age of the individual grave began. Dotted across the landscape, often deliberately placed on hilltops and ridges inside of the old, now silent, megalithic centers, a new kind of mound began to appear. The round barrow. It was a simple, elegant, and profoundly personal statement. Unlike the long barrows, which were great, multi-generational bone houses, the round barrow was almost always built for one person. It was a final, focused tribute to a single life. Inside, at the heart of the earthen mound, you would find not a jumbled collection of sorted bones, but a single, articulated skeleton. A person lay to rest, with a care and intimacy that was entirely new. They were often placed in a crouched, sleeping position, as if waiting to be reborn, and they were sent into the next world fully equipped. This was not about joining the anonymous mass of ancestors. This was about continuing your personal journey, your identity intact, and what an identity it was. The objects placed in these graves were the components of the Beaker package, a carefully curated set of personal effects that spoke of a new kind of hero. Cradled in the arms of the deceased, you would often find their personal, exquisitely decorated beaker pot, perhaps containing a final drink of ale or mead for the journey. Lying by their hip would be the new symbol of masculine power, the tanged copper dagger, a weapon of a beauty and lethality never before seen, its metallic gleam a sign of access to the new, magical technology. On their wrist, they might wear a polished stone bracer, the mark of a master archer, and scattered around them, the beautiful, barbed and tanged flint arrowheads that were the ammunition for this new form of elite warfare. This was the burial of a warrior, a hunter, a hero. The grave goods were not generic offerings. They were his beaker, his dagger, his bow. It was an assertion of personal identity and status that would have been utterly alien to the builders of the great communal tombs. So why did this happen? Why did a 1,000-year-old tradition of collective monument building, which had reached such a spectacular climax at Stonehenge, simply wither and die? The answer lies in the little copper dagger. The arrival of metallurgy was not just a technological shift, it was a social and economic cataclysm. The power of the old Neolithic chieftains had been rooted in the land. It came from their ability to mobilize their kin group, their lineage, to clear the forest, farm the fields, and build the great monuments that honored the ancestors who gave them their claim to that land. It was a power based on community and inheritance, but metal changed the rules of the game entirely. Copper, and a few centuries later, bronze, were not available everywhere. The ores had to be mined in specific, remote locations, in Wales, in Ireland, in Cornwall, and the knowledge of how to smelt, alloy, and cast them was a specialist, almost magical secret. This created, for the first time, long-distance trade routes in a truly exotic, high-value commodity. Power no longer came solely from who your ancestors were, or how much land your clan farmed. It now came to the individuals who could control this new prestigious trade. The strong man, the charismatic leader, the daring trader who could navigate these dangerous new networks and bring back the gleaming metal daggers, axes, and gold ornaments. He was the new hero. His power was personal, portable, and not dependent on the approval of the ancestors. This new mobile wealth created a more competitive, more stratified, and more individualistic society. It was a heroic age, a time of big men and powerful chiefs whose status was defined not by their place in a lineage, but by their personal prowess and the exotic treasures they could command. In such a world, why would you spend your resources and your people's labor on a great communal temple? It made far more sense to use that wealth to accumulate personal prestige goods and to ensure your own magnificent individual burial, a final spectacular display of the power you had accrued in your own lifetime. The great megalithic sites were not violently destroyed. Their twilight was a slow, gentle fading. For a time, the new beaker elite seemed to have tried to co-opt their power. Some of the most richly furnished beaker burials, like the famous Amesbury Archer, are clustered around Stonehenge, as if these new chieftains were trying to legitimize their rule by associating themselves with the ancient sanctity of the place. They may have continued to use the stone circle for their own ceremonies, reinterpreting its meaning to fit their own sky gods. But the creative fire, the social engine that drove their construction, was dead. No new sarcens were raised, no new henges dug. The knowledge of their original purpose, the complex solar and ancestral religion of their builders, began to fade, becoming a half-remembered folklore, then a mystery. The great stones were left to the wind and the rain, magnificent but mute, the abandoned cathedrals of a forgotten faith, waiting for a new age of iron, of Romans, and eventually of us, to find them again and begin the long, slow process of trying to understand what they meant. And so the lights went out on the world of the great stone builders. Their universe, which had seemed so permanent, so anchored to the eternal cycles of the sun and the ever-present company of the ancestors, had simply stopped. The round barrows of the new Bronze Age chiefs now pimpled the skyline, each one a monument to a single heroic life, not the collective soul of a lineage. The great henges, once the vibrant stages for island-wide festivals, fell silent, their ditches slowly, imperceptibly, silting up, their great timber posts surrendering to the quiet, patient work of the fungus and the worm. But the stones, of course, did not go away. The long barrows did not crumble. The standing stones did not rot. They remained, stripped of their original purpose, abandoned by the descendants of their creators. They ceased to be active places of worship and became something else entirely. A mystery, a memory, and a permanent feature of the landscape itself. They became echoes in the earth. For the thousands of years that followed, these monuments were a constant, silent presence in the lives of the people who farmed the land around them. The Bronze Age warrior, the Iron Age Celt, the Roman legionary, the Saxon farmer, they all saw them. They walked past them every day. They incorporated them into their own mental maps of the world. But the original instruction manual was lost. And so, they invented new stories, new meanings, weaving these strange, ancient lumps and pillars into their own folklore. The long barrows, those great, humped houses of the Neolithic dead, became the lairs of dragons, the dwelling places of goblins or giants. A farmer, ploughing his field, might think twice about disturbing the soil of the giant's grave on the hill, not because he was honoring the Neolithic ancestors, but because he feared the wrath of the mythical being he believed to sleep within. The standing stones, the lonely menhirs, and the circles were often seen as people, petrified for some ancient transgression. Dancers turned to stone for reveling on the Sabbath, or an invading army frozen in place by a wizard's curse. Stonehenge itself, the greatest and most baffling of them all, became the work of the devil, or of Merlin the magician, who was said to have spirited the stones from Ireland with a flick of his wrist. These stories, as fanciful as they are, represent a remarkable act of cultural memory, or rather, of cultural repurposing. The monuments were too powerful, too undeniably present to be simply ignored. They demanded an explanation, and in the absence of history, people created myth. And yet, is it possible that somewhere within this folklore, a distorted, broken echo of the original truth survived? This is one of the most tantalizing and unprovable mysteries of all. When a local legend speaks of a stone circle as a place of healing, is it just a story, or is it a folk memory that has trickled down through 5,000 years? A faint whisper of the original belief that brought the bluestones all the way from their magical healing mountains in Wales. When a farmer calls a particular mound the fairy toot, is it possible that the fairies, or the little people, are a distant mythological echo of the ancestors themselves? The spirits who were once believed to dwell within? We can never know for sure. It's like listening to a piece of music played from 1,000 rooms away. You might catch a faint scrap of the melody, but the richness, the harmony, the lyrics are gone forever. And so they slept. These gentle giants in the landscape, their true stories veiled in myth, until a new kind of curiosity began to stir in the 17th and 18th centuries, with men like John Aubrey and William Stukeley. These first antiquarians, armed not with trowels and carbon dating, but with notebooks and a sense of romantic wonder, were the first to look at these monuments and see not the work of wizards, but the work of people. They measured, they drew, they mapped. They were often wrong in their conclusions. Stukeley, for instance, became obsessed with the idea that the stone circles were temples of the Druids. But they were right in their fundamental instinct. They knew they were looking at the ruins of a lost British civilization, a chapter of the island's story that had been completely erased from the history books. They lit the first flickering candle in the long dark room of prehistory, and in doing so, they founded the science of archaeology. And now today, we live more intimately with these echoes than ever before. We can date them, analyze the lipids in their pots, sequence the DNA from their bones. We know more about the daily lives of the people of Skara Brae than we do about many periods of far more recent history. And yet, the central mystery, the true nature of their spiritual world, remains as elusive as ever. But their presence endures. It's in the hump of a round barrow that crowns a walking trail on the South Downs. It's in the single, grey, standing stone that a farmer has ploughed around for generations, a silent partner in his field. And it is, of course, in the overwhelming, soul-stirring majesty of Stonehenge, as the sun rises over the heelstone on a summer morning, just as its builders intended. These are more than just ruins. They are the foundational marks on the land, the first great acts of placemaking. They are the oldest things in the British story that were built to last, a quiet, constant reminder that the ground beneath our feet is not empty, but is layered with the dreams, the beliefs, and the immense, patient labor of those who came before. And so now, as our long story comes to its gentle end, and as you prepare for your own quiet rest, perhaps you can feel a little of that deep time, that long, slow, peaceful continuity. The world is old, but it is still here. The stones are still here, and all is well. Sleep now.